In the mist-choked highlands of Vietnam, a weary American platoon was about to make their final push toward an enemy stronghold. What should have been a routine reconnaissance mission turned into a waking nightmare when the jungle itself betrayed them. The Viet Cong had been waiting. Captain Michael Graves wasn't just another officer in the field. For 15 years he had survived the most brutal operations in 2 wars, earning a reputation for seeing threats before they struck. Men whispered about his instincts, how he had led teams out of impossible ambushes. But this time, even Graves hadn't seen it coming. When the Viet Cong sprung their trap, they had no idea they were walking into something far worse. The Americans had stumbled upon a relic of war older than their own conflict, a secret buried beneath the jungle floor, a force no army could control. As the first shots rang out, the ground trembled, and reality itself seemed to fold. What began as an ambush would become something far more terrifying. The highland jungle would never be the same after the horrors that were about to be unleashed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Michael Graves felt the jungle watching him. 16 hours into their trek, the platoon moved like ghosts through the emerald labyrinth of Vietnam's highland forest. 23 men, each carrying enough ammunition, rations, and fear to last a week in hell. The air hung thick with moisture, clinging to their skin like a second uniform while the canopy above filtered the morning light into strange, shifting patterns on the forest floor. 5-minute break, Graves whispered. The command passed down, the line in hushed tones. He wiped sweat from his brow, careful not to disturb the mud-streaked camouflage paint. His eyes never stopped scanning, forward, up, then back to the men. Lieutenant Daniel "Danny" Holt approached, his boyish face masked by grime and exhaustion, but still carrying that persistent optimism Graves both envied and distrusted. "Water's holding out better than expected, Captain," Holt reported, voice deliberately upbeat. "Men are tired but moving well. Another 8 clicks to the objective if the maps are accurate." "Maps are never accurate in this goddamn place," Graves muttered, studying the worn piece of paper in his hands. Intelligence had indicated a Viet Cong stronghold nestled in the valley ahead, a command post coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. Their mission: confirm location, assess strength, call in air support. Simple, clean, the kind of mission that got men killed. Sergeant Carlos Mendoza materialized from the foliage, moving with the silent efficiency that had earned him the nickname Reaper. His dark eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much jungle, too many ambushes. "Something's wrong, Captain," Mendoza said without preamble, his voice a sandpaper whisper. "Charlie?" Graves asked, instantly alert. Mendoza's head tilted slightly. "Not sure. Trail's been too clean. Found footprints back there. Fresh. Then they just stop, mid-stride. Like whoever made them just disappeared." Holt frowned. "Probably just doubled back on a rock or something." "I know the difference," Mendoza snapped, then composed himself. "Sir, I've been point man on 14 missions. This one feels off. The birds stopped singing 2 clicks back. No monkeys. Even the insects are quieter." Graves had learned to trust Mendoza's instincts. The man was a human seismograph for danger. "Keep it tight," Graves ordered. "Double check. Noise discipline. I want 2 men on point instead of 1. The radio operator approached, a lanky kid from New York with a perpetual half-smile. Corporal James Carter, Brooklyn, to everyone who'd served with him more than a day. "Captain, getting some weird interference on the radio," Brooklyn said, adjusting dials on the bulky equipment strapped to his back. "Signals clean 1 minute, then it's like someone's broadcasting static the next. Never heard anything like it. Distance? That's just it, sir. We're well within range of base. Signal should be 5 by 5. Graves nodded. "Keep trying. We need that comms link." As the platoon resumed their march, Graves felt the weight of command pressing down harder than his pack. 23 lives. 23 men looking to him to bring them home. He thought of the letter folded in his breast pocket, the one he'd written to his sister before leaving base. He always wrote one, never sent one. A ritual, a promise to return. 3 hours later, they found the abandoned camp. "Secure the perimeter," Graves ordered as they approached the clearing. The camp consisted of 6 makeshift huts nestled beneath the jungle canopy recently vacated. Cooking fires still smoldered. Spent bullet casings littered the dirt. They left in a hurry, Holt observed, kicking over an unfinished bowl of rice. "Maybe they knew we were coming." Mendoza shook his head. "No, they'd have taken the weapons." He pointed to a stack of rifles leaning against one of the huts, pristine and ready for use. Brooklyn whistled low. "Who leaves behind perfectly good AKs?" The men spread out, searching the camp with practiced efficiency. Graves moved toward the largest structure, ducking inside to find maps spread across a crude table, weights holding down the corners. Red marks indicated American positions, supply routes, patrol patterns. Some of the information was days old. Some of it was tonight's planned movements. "We've got a leak," Graves muttered, studying the intelligence that shouldn't have been in enemy hands. "Sir," a voice called from outside. "You need to see this." Graves emerged to find Private Wilson pointing at a tree at the camp's edge. Deep marks had been carved into the bark, strange angular symbols unlike anything Graves had seen before. "They're all over, sir," Wilson reported. "Every tree around the perimeter." Holt approached, frowning. "Viet Cong markers?" "Not like any I've seen," Mendoza said, touching one of the marks. His hand came away wet with sap. "These are fresh, hours old." Graves scanned the tree line, feeling again that unsettling sensation of being watched. The jungle seemed to press closer around them as though the very trees were leaning in to listen. "Sir," Brooklyn called, voice tight with controlled tension. "Found something else." The object sat half buried in vines at the edge of the clearing, a metallic structure about the size of a footlocker, its surface a dull gunmetal gray that seemed to absorb the light around it. No markings, no visible seams or hinges. "That's not VC," Holt said quietly. "That looks American." Graves knelt beside the object, careful not to touch it. "Anyone recognize this? Military equipment, research?" Heads shook. The metal seemed to pulse with a subtle vibration, felt more than heard. "Captain," Mendoza said, voice suddenly urgent, "we should go, now." Before Graves could respond, a scream tore through the camp. Private Jackson stumbled forward, face contorted in pain, blood streaming from his leg where a punji trap had snapped closed around his calf. "Medic!" Graves called, rushing to the fallen soldier. The platoon's medic worked quickly, applying pressure to the wound, while Mendoza scanned the ground around them. "That wasn't there before," Mendoza insisted, pointing to the trap. "We swept this entire area." Brooklyn's radio suddenly erupted with a burst of static so loud it made the men flinch. Through the white noise came something else, a sound like whispering, dozens of voices speaking in languages none of them recognized. "What the hell is that?" Holt demanded. Brooklyn adjusted dials frantically. "I don't know, sir. It's not coming from any frequency we use. It's like, it's everywhere." The whispers grew louder, seeming to emanate from the jungle itself. Men raised their rifles instinctively, forming a defensive circle around their injured comrade. "Captain?" Holt looked to Graves, the first flicker of doubt crossing his features. Graves made his decision. "We're moving out, now. This position is compromised." As they prepared to leave, Mendoza approached Graves, voice low enough that only the captain could hear. "Sir, the footprints I found earlier, they were heading away from this camp, like they were fleeing something." Graves nodded grimly. "We'll follow the original route to the objective. Stay alert." The platoon moved out, Jackson supported between 2 men. The whispers followed them, rippling through the trees like wind. Graves led from the front, compass in hand, but after an hour of marching, he stopped abruptly. "This isn't right," he muttered, checking his bearings again. "We should have reached the ridge by now." Holt frowned, consulting his own map. "We've been heading due east the whole time." "No," Graves said, certainty growing in his gut. "We're going in circles." At that moment, the jungle erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the trees ahead. The distinctive crack of AK-47s shattered the heavy air. "Contact front," Mendoza shouted, dropping to one knee and returning fire. 3 o'clock. Brooklyn's voice cut through the chaos. "Captain, radio's dead." Graves took cover behind a fallen tree, the familiar rhythm of combat displacing the earlier unease. This, at least, was an enemy he understood. "Spread out," he ordered. "Return fire, conserve ammunition." As his men took up defensive positions, Graves caught a glimpse of movement through the trees. Soldiers in black pajamas, moving with practiced efficiency. The Viet Cong had found them. Or perhaps they had been waiting all along. In the strobing light of muzzle flashes, Graves saw Mendoza's face, tight with concentration but also something else. Not fear. The Reaper had left fear behind years ago. Something worse. Certainty. The jungle had sprung its trap, and they were caught in the middle of something far deadlier than an ambush. The first RPG streaked through the trees, detonating, against a massive trunk 10 feet to Graves's left. Splinters and shrapnel tore through the air as men dove for cover. "Spread out," Graves shouted above the din. "They're trying to bunch us up." Through the smoke and chaos, he caught glimpses of the enemy. Disciplined, coordinated movements that spoke of careful planning. This was no random patrol. They had walked into a prepared killing zone. Private Michaels took a round to the shoulder and spun backward, blood spraying across the undergrowth. Brooklyn dragged him behind a fallen log, still clutching his useless radio. "Captain!" Holt slid into position beside Graves, firing controlled 3-round bursts toward a cluster of muzzle flashes. "East flank is collapsing. They've got at least 30 men out there." Graves's mind raced through their dwindling options. The ridgeline behind them offered the only defensible position within reach, but getting there meant a dangerous sprint through open ground. "Mendoza," he called. "Covering fire on my mark. Lieutenant, get the wounded moving toward that ridge. Brooklyn, stay with them." The sergeant acknowledged with a curt nod, his M16 already chattering a deadly rhythm. Mendoza moved like a machine, each shot finding its target with uncanny precision. 3 VC fighters fell in rapid succession. Across the battlefield, hidden in the dense foliage, Commander Nguyen Bao watched the American platoon's disciplined response with grudging respect. The ambush had been perfect. Intelligence had placed the Americans exactly where they would be when they would be there, yet somehow they were holding. "Flank them from the north," Bao ordered his second in command. "Force them into the ravine." The man nodded and disappeared into the underbrush, signaling to a group of fighters who began working their way around the Americans' position. Back at the front line, Graves gave the order. "Now, move." The platoon executed the retreat with practiced precision, leapfrogging back in pairs while others provided covering fire. They had almost reached the relative safety of the ridge when Brooklyn's voice cut through the gunfire. "Captain, something's wrong with Diaz." Graves turned to see Private Diaz standing upright in the middle of the battlefield, his weapon hanging limp at his side. The young soldier's eyes were wide, fixed on something in the trees that no one else could see. "Diaz, get down," Graves shouted. The private didn't respond. Instead, he began walking forward, straight toward the enemy position, mumbling words no one could make out. Holt lunged from cover, tackling Diaz to the ground just as bullets tore through the space where he had been standing. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, dragging the disoriented soldier back to cover. "They're in the trees," Diaz whispered, his eyes unfocused. "Can't you hear them? They're calling us." Mendoza fired another burst, then turned to Graves. "Sir, we've got movement on our right flank." "There." He stopped mid-sentence, staring past Graves with an expression the captain had never seen on the hardened sergeant's face. Pure, unfiltered shock. Graves followed his gaze. 30 yards away, a VC fighter emerged from behind a tree, weapon raised, then suddenly screamed. The man's body contorted unnaturally, his spine arching backward as though pulled by invisible hands. Then, impossibly, he began to sink into the ground. Not falling, not stumbling, sinking, as though the solid earth had become quicksand. His screams continued until only his reaching hand remained above the surface. fingers clawing desperately at air before they too disappeared. The battlefield fell momentarily silent. What? What the fuck was that? Brooklyn whispered, his face drained of color. Across the clearing, the VC fighters had stopped advancing. Some were backing away, firing wildly at empty air. Others turned their weapons on each other, shouting in confused terror. Bao watched in horror as his carefully orchestrated attack disintegrated into chaos. One of his men ran past, eyes wide with panic. "Commander," the man gasped. "The shadows, they move. Tran and Min are gone." Before Bao could respond, a strange mist began seeping from the ground where the soldier had disappeared. It coiled, upward, forming shapes that seemed almost human before dissolving again. "Sir," Holt's voice wavered as he addressed Graves. "What are we seeing here?" Graves had no answer. In 15 years of military service, through 2 wars and countless firefights, he had never witnessed anything like this. The rules of combat, of reality itself, seemed to have been suspended. "Regroup," he ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. "Wounded in the center, form a perimeter." As the platoon tightened their formation, Brooklyn's radio suddenly crackled to life. Not with the standard military channels, but with a cacophony of whispers. This time they were louder, more insistent. "It's not English," Brooklyn said, adjusting dials with trembling hands. "Not Vietnamese either. I don't think it's any language I've ever heard." Mendoza, who had been scanning the battlefield, suddenly grabbed Graves's arm. "Sir, 2 o'clock. Another VC fighter stood at the edge of the clearing. As they watched, the man's shadow began to elongate, stretching impossibly across the ground. The fighter noticed too late. His scream pierced the air as the shadow rose up, enveloping him completely before collapsing in on itself, leaving nothing behind. "We need to move," Graves decided. "Now. Whatever this is, we can't fight it." The platoon began a strategic withdrawal, abandoning the ridge line for the deeper jungle. The VC forces seemed to have come to the same conclusion, their attack patterns, disintegrating as men fled in all directions. Private Wilson stumbled, clutching his side where blood seeped through his fingers. "Captain, I can't—" The ground beneath Wilson rippled. There was no other word for it. The solid earth moved like water. Before anyone could react, tendrils of soil wrapped around the private's legs, pulling him downward. "Help me!" Wilson screamed, clawing desperately at the ground around him. Graves and Mendoza lunged forward, grabbing Wilson's arms. For a moment, it seemed they might save him. Then the pull intensified. Wilson sank to his chest, then his neck, his terrified eyes the last thing to disappear beneath the surface. The ground solidified instantly, leaving no trace he had ever been there. "Jesus Christ," Holt whispered, the lieutenant's face ashen. "That's not possible. That's not fucking possible." "Diaz was right," Brooklyn said, his voice hollow. "The jungle. It's alive. It's hunting us." Graves forced his racing mind to focus. They needed shelter, somewhere defensible against both human enemies and whatever else was out there. "There's a river 2 clicks east," he said. "We make for that. Water might slow it down." "Slow down what?" Holt demanded, his voice cracking. "What exactly do you think we're dealing with, Captain? This can't be real." "It's real enough to kill Wilson," Mendoza snapped, "and half the VC force out there." As they moved through the jungle, the sounds of combat faded, replaced by sporadic screams that echoed through the trees. Human screams, filled with a terror that transcended the normal fear of battle. 20 minutes into their retreat, they encountered a sight that stopped them cold. A group of VC fighters huddled in a defensive circle, firing outward at the empty jungle. But it wasn't their presence that froze the Americans. It was what happened next. One by one, the Vietnamese soldiers began to flicker, like images on a damaged film reel. Their bodies became transparent, then solid again, the process repeating with increasing speed until they simply winked out of existence, leaving behind only their weapons and equipment. They just disappeared. Holt whispered, "The last of his skepticism crumbling. Bao had seen enough. The American platoon was no longer his primary concern. Something far worse had claimed the jungle. He had lost 17 men, not to enemy fire but to an enemy that defied comprehension. As his remaining fighters retreated in disarray, Bao made a decision that went against everything he believed. He would seek out the American commander, not to fight but to understand. The crack of a branch behind him made Bao spin, rifle raised. Captain Graves stood 20 feet away, his own weapon at the ready. For a long moment the two commanders stared at each other across the clearing, enemies by oath and training. But something else watched them both from the shadows, something ancient and patient and hungry. And in that moment, both men recognized a terrible truth. The war between their nations was no longer the greatest threat in this jungle. Neither man lowered his weapon. Graves and Bao stood frozen in their standoff, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Around them the jungle had fallen eerily silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of wind through leaves. Just the ragged breathing of two enemies measuring each other across 20 feet of blood-soaked earth. Behind Graves, Mendoza took aim at Bao's head. "Say the word, Captain." Lieutenant Holt and the remaining members of the platoon formed a ragged semicircle, weapons trained on the Vietnamese commander. But Bao stood his ground, alone, yet unafraid. "Your men," Bao finally said in accented English, breaking the silence. "How many have you lost to the shadows?" The question caught Graves off guard. 3 confirmed, maybe more. Bao nodded grimly. 17 of mine. Vanished. Swallowed by the earth. Taken by things I cannot explain. He lowered his rifle slowly, deliberately. "This is no longer a battle between soldiers." "Could be a trick," Holt whispered, not taking his eyes off Bao. "Sir, we can't trust them." Brooklyn shifted nervously, the dead radio on his back emitting occasional bursts of static. "Captain, whatever's happening here, it's hitting them worse than us. Look around." Graves had already noticed. The bodies of Viet Cong fighters lay scattered throughout the clearing, but many showed no signs of bullet wounds. Some appeared to have died in terror, their faces frozen in silent screams. Others had simply collapsed, as though the life had been extracted from them in an instant. "Where are the rest of your men?" Graves asked Bao. "Scattered, running, dying." Bao's expression remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a haunted quality. Some turned their weapons on themselves rather than face what hunts in these trees. A low moan drifted through the canopy above. Not wind, not an animal. Something else. Something watching. Graves made his decision. "Lower weapons. Not down, just lowered." "Sir," Holt began to protest. "Do it, Lieutenant." Graves's tone left no room for argument. "Whatever's out there is killing both sides. I want to know what he knows." Reluctantly, the Americans lowered, their rifles to a ready position. Bao nodded once in acknowledgement, then spoke with the terse efficiency of a man who knew time was running out. "Your military brought something to this jungle," he said. "A weapon, an experiment. My intelligence said American scientists were testing something near this valley, something that would turn the tide of war." "That's bullshit," Holt interjected. "We didn't—" "The metal box," Mendoza cut in, his eyes widening with realization. "That thing at the abandoned camp. It wasn't VC equipment. It was ours." Graves felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. "What else do you know?" "Only rumors," Bao replied. "Whispers of a weapon that attacks the mind, that blurs the line between what is real and what is not." He gestured to the silent jungle around them. "I did not believe such things until today." A scream tore through the air, human, desperate, coming from somewhere to their right. One of Bao's men stumbled into the clearing, his uniform torn, face streaked with mud and terror. He shouted frantically in Vietnamese, pointing back the way he had come. Bao responded sharply, then turned to Graves. "More of my men. Close. Being hunted." "By what?" "He says, by their own shadows." As if on cue, the foliage parted, and 3 more Vietnamese soldiers emerged, firing blindly behind them. One man's shadow stretched impossibly long across the ground, rippling with movement that didn't match its owner's. The soldier noticed. Too late. He screamed as his shadow rose up like smoke, wrapping around him, constricting. His comrades watched in horror as he was crushed by darkness itself, his body crumpling like paper before dissolving into the ground. Jesus Christ, Brooklyn whispered, crossing himself. The remaining VC fighters ran toward Bao, shouting frantically. Their shadows stretched behind them, elongating with each step, reaching. Run, Graves shouted to his men. Back to the ridge. Move. Americans and Vietnamese alike broke into a desperate sprint, survival temporarily overriding years of trained hatred. They crashed through the undergrowth as one unit, no longer enemies, but prey fleeing a common predator. They reached the ridgeline, gasping for breath, taking cover among the rocks. For a moment it seemed they had outpaced whatever hunted them. The shadows here were normal, fixed to their owners by the laws of physics that still seemed to apply in this small pocket of sanity. Graves did a quick head count. 14 of his men remained, plus Bao and 4 of his fighters, less than half of what both sides had started with. We need to establish a perimeter, Graves began, falling back on military procedure in the absence of any better ideas. A perimeter will not stop what hunts us, Captain, Bao interrupted. He conferred briefly with his men, then turned back to Graves. There is a place nearby. Old tunnels from the Japanese occupation. Deep. Stone. Perhaps safer than the open jungle. Holt shook his head vehemently. No way, we're not following him into VC tunnels, that's suicide. And staying here isn't? Brooklyn countered, his usual humor replaced by naked fear. Look around, Lieutenant. Whatever's out there, it's changed the rules. Captain, permission to scout ahead, Mendoza requested, though his voice lacked its usual steady confidence. I'll check if the commander's tunnels are what he says they are. Graves nodded. Take Martinez with you. 15 minutes, then back. As Mendoza disappeared into the trees with one of Bao's men as guide, an uneasy silence fell over the mixed group. Americans and Vietnamese eyed each other warily, fingers never straying far from triggers despite the tentative truce. Brooklyn sat with his back against a boulder, fiddling with the radio dials. Still getting that weird interference, he reported, but now it's pulsing like a heartbeat. Graves moved closer to examine the radio. The static ebbed and flowed in a rhythmic pattern, and beneath it those same whispers they'd heard before, unintelligible, yet somehow conveying meaning. A warning, perhaps. Or a threat. You hear it too, Bao observed, watching Graves's reaction. The voices. What are they saying? Graves asked. Bao shook his head. Not Vietnamese. Not any language of man. He hesitated, then added, My grandfather was a village shaman. He would say these are the voices of ancestors, or demons. Holt scoffed. Superstitious nonsense. There's a rational explanation for all of this. Is there, Lieutenant? Graves challenged quietly. We just watched men get swallowed by their own shadows, pulled into solid ground. What's your rational explanation for that? Before Holt could respond, Mendoza returned, his face even grimmer than when he'd left. Tunnels are there, he confirmed. About half a click east. But sir, you need to see what we found on the way. Graves followed Mendoza into the jungle, Bao and Holt close behind. 100 yards from the ridge, they came upon a sight that defied comprehension. Bodies, American and Vietnamese alike, arranged in a perfect circle, but not lying on the ground. Suspended in mid-air, their limbs contorted at impossible angles, faces frozen in expressions of agony. At the center of the circle lay their weapons, neatly stacked in a pyramid. I counted 8 of ours, 13 VC, Mendoza reported mechanically, his voice detached. No blood, no bullet wounds, just positioned, like a display. Or a warning, Bao added quietly. Holt stumbled backward, finally confronted with evidence he couldn't rationalize away. What? What could do this? We need to get to those tunnels, Graves decided. Now. They returned to the ridge and quickly organized the survivors. No one needed to be told twice after hearing Mendoza's report. Bao took point, leading them through the jungle at a careful pace, every sense alert for signs of the unnaturalness that seemed to be spreading through the valley. Mendoza fell in beside Graves as they walked, his voice pitched low. "Captain, I need to tell you something." Graves noted the sergeant's expression, not fear exactly, but a bone-deep certainty that chilled him more than panic would have. "When we found those bodies," Mendoza continued, "I recognized one of them, Stevens. The thing is, Captain, Stevens wasn't with us on this mission. He was wounded last week, evacuated to Saigon." Graves felt the implications sink in like lead weights. "You're sure?" "Positive, sir. I wrote the letter to his mother myself." Neither man spoke for several minutes, the revelation settling between them like a physical presence. "We're already dead," Mendoza finally whispered. "Aren't we, sir? This jungle, it's not just killing us, it's unmaking us, erasing us from existence itself." For once, Graves had no reassurance to offer. The thought had already occurred to him that perhaps what they were experiencing wasn't just an attack, but something more fundamental, a corruption of reality itself. Brooklyn's voice interrupted his dark thoughts. "Captain, got something on the radio." The transmission was clearer this time, cutting through the static in sharp bursts. Not whispers now, but a voice, a human voice speaking English. "Area is quarantined. Project Lighthouse. Containment failure. No survivors expected." Then, more disturbingly, "Reality degradation spreading. Destruction authorized. Napalm drop at 0600. Graves checked his watch. 1643 hours. Less than 14 hours until the entire valley would be cleansed with fire. "They know," Holt whispered. "Command knows about this thing. They're going to burn it all. With us in it," Brooklyn added grimly. Bao, who had been listening intently, met Graves's eyes. No words were necessary. Both commanders understood their situation had just become even more desperate. 20 minutes later, they reached the tunnel entrance, a narrow opening half hidden by vegetation, descending steeply into darkness. It looked ancient, the stone around it weathered by decades of monsoon seasons. "My men will go first," Bao offered, "to show there is no trap." Graves nodded, watching as two Vietnamese fighters slipped into the darkness, flashlights casting weak beams into the gloom. After a tense minute, one returned, nodding to Bao. "It is clear," Bao translated. "The tunnel branches deeper, but the main chamber is empty." One by one, the survivors descended into the earth, grateful for the solid stone walls after the living nightmare the jungle had become. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber about 30 feet across with several smaller passages branching off. Old support beams, remnants from the Japanese occupation, groaned softly overhead. "We'll set up here," Graves decided. "Defensive, positions at each tunnel. 2-hour watch rotations." As the men organized themselves, Brooklyn continued monitoring the radio, hoping for more transmissions that might explain what they were facing. Holt paced nervously, casting suspicious glances at the Vietnamese fighters who kept to their own corner of the chamber. Mendoza approached Graves again, his voice pitched for the captain's ears only. "Sir, I don't think the tunnels will save us." "They're buying us time," Graves replied. "Time to figure out what we're dealing with." "And if we can't?" Graves had no answer. Bao joined them, his face illuminated eerily in the beam of a flashlight. "Your government," he said without preamble. "They made this thing that hunts us?" "I don't know," Graves admitted, "but it seems likely." "To win your war," Bao stated, not a question but an accusation. Graves met his gaze steadily. "Would your side have done any differently, if you had the capability?" "Perhaps not," Bao conceded after a moment, "but intention matters little now. We are all meat for the same beast." The Vietnamese commander reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. From the camp. I found this before the attack. Graves unfolded it carefully. It was a photograph, worn and creased, showing a group of men in lab coats standing around a metallic device identical to the one they'd found in the abandoned camp. The background showed dense jungle, but nothing to identify the specific location. On the back, someone had written a single line. Project Lighthouse, Phase 1 deployment. My government received intelligence about American scientists working in this valley, Bao explained. That is why we set the ambush. We believed you were here to deploy a new weapon. We weren't, Graves said. We were just a reconnaissance. Patrol. Perhaps, Bao replied, unconvinced. Or perhaps your commanders did not tell you the true purpose of your mission. The accusation hit uncomfortably close to Graves's own suspicions. Their orders had been unusually vague, the intelligence suspiciously precise. Before he could pursue this line of thought, Brooklyn's voice cut through the chamber, tight with terror. Captain! The radio! Everyone froze as the static crackled, then resolved into a clear, emotionless voice that echoed from the speaker. You are not supposed to be here. The radio's message hung in the air like a physical presence. You are not supposed to be here. Brooklyn dropped the handset as if it had burned him. The radio emitted one final burst of static, then fell silent. That? Holt's voice wavered. That was English, perfect English. Who's broadcasting? Graves demanded, picking up the handset. Brooklyn shook his head. That's just it, sir. We're not receiving a transmission. The radio's damaged, it shouldn't be working at all. The implications settled over the group like a shroud. Whatever had spoken to them wasn't using military channels or any conventional means of communication. It had simply reached out. We need to learn more, Graves decided, turning to Bao. You said these tunnels branch deeper. Have your men explored the entire system? No, Bao replied. My scout reported multiple passages, but we entered only this main chamber. Graves addressed the mixed group of survivors. We split into 3 teams. Explore each of the main branches. Look for anything that might explain what's happening, what this Project Lighthouse is. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sir, Mendoza interjected, splitting up might not be wise. Staying here just makes us easy targets, Graves countered. If this thing can speak through a dead radio, these stone walls won't keep it out for long. He quickly organized the teams. Mendoza would lead one group down the eastern passage with 3 Americans and one of Bao's men. Holt would take the western branch with another mixed team. Graves, Brooklyn, and Bao would explore the central tunnel, which appeared to descend deeper than the others. 2 hours, Graves instructed. Then we meet back here. Anything happens, anything strange, you fire a single shot as warning. The group separated, flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. As Graves led his team deeper into the central passage, the air grew noticeably colder, heavy with the scent of wet stone and something else, a metallic tang that reminded him of blood. These tunnels, Brooklyn whispered, his voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. They don't look like VC work, too old. Japanese, Bao confirmed, from the occupation, but some sections may be older still. There are stories of temple complexes beneath these mountains, places where the ancients conducted rituals to appease forest spirits. Brooklyn laughed nervously. No offense, Commander, but I'm pretty sure whatever's out there isn't some angry forest spirit. Perhaps not, Bao replied evenly. But your government may have found something old and powerful that they did not understand, something that should have remained buried. The tunnel widened into another chamber, smaller than the first but clearly modified more recently. Rotting wooden tables lined one wall, strewn with rusted equipment and moldering papers. In one corner, a generator lay on its side, covered in decades of grime. This is American, Graves said, examining the abandoned equipment. 1940s, maybe earlier. OSS, perhaps, Bao suggested. Your spies were active in this region during the Japanese occupation. Brooklyn moved to the tables, carefully sorting through the decayed papers. Some of these are still readable. Research notes, looks like. He picked up a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age but largely intact. Captain, you should see this. Graves took the journal, angling his flashlight to better illuminate the faded handwriting. March 15, 1943. Expedition successful. Artifact recovered from temple ruins. Properties unknown, but reaction to electrical stimulation promising. Native guides refused to approach it. 2 disappeared last night. Desertion suspected. March 18, 1943. First tests yielding unexpected results. Artifact appears to bend light around itself. Animals exposed to its field exhibit unusual behavior. Temporal anomalies observed. Chronometers near the device run at different speeds. March 25, 1943. Control becoming difficult. Johnson disappeared during night shift. Search parties found nothing. Local workers claim the jungle has awakened and is hungry. Scientific nonsense, but morale deteriorating. April 1943. Something is wrong with the artifact. Power fluctuations increasing. Reality distortions extending beyond test chamber. Requesting immediate evacuation and containment protocols. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawls. God help us. It's aware, it's aware. The jungle sees us now. Time is wrong. Shadows move. Too late for evacuation. If found, destroy the lighthouse. Do not activate. Reality will. The entry ended in a violent streak of ink. Jesus, Brooklyn whispered, reading over Graves's shoulder. They found something here, in the 40s. Something that messed with reality itself. And now our government has redeployed it, Graves concluded grimly. As a weapon. Bao's expression hardened. Your people brought this curse back to our lands? I didn't know, Graves said, though the denial felt hollow. None of us knew. Brooklyn continued searching through the papers. Here's something else. Coordinates, maps. He held up a yellowed diagram. Looks like they built a containment facility, about 3 kilometers northwest of here. The metal box we found, Graves realized. It must have been part of the device. A beacon or trigger of some kind. Further exploration of the chamber revealed more grim discoveries. Human remains, so old that only bones remained, scattered among the abandoned equipment. Whatever had happened here, the research team hadn't survived it. A shout echoed from one of the side passages, followed by a single gunshot, the warning signal. Graves led Brooklyn and Bao back through the tunnels at a run, emerging into the main chamber just as Holt's team returned from the western passage. The lieutenant's face was ashen. Captain, you need to see this. They followed Holt's team through the western tunnel, which opened into a smaller chamber partially flooded, with groundwater. But it wasn't the chamber itself that had prompted the warning shot. It was what lined its walls. Photographs, hundreds of them, pinned to the stone. Recent photographs. That's us, Brooklyn whispered in disbelief. The images showed their platoon, not from this mission but from previous operations. Graves recognized scenes from patrols they'd conducted weeks ago. Images of their base camp, photos of the men sleeping, eating, cleaning their weapons. We've been watched, Holt said, his voice hollow. For months. But the Vietnamese soldiers had an even more disturbing discovery. Among the photographs were images of Bao's unit as well, surveillance photos showing their camps, their movements, their strategies. Both sides, Bao said quietly. Observed, studied, like insects under glass. Graves examined the photos more closely. Some showed operations he didn't recognize, men from their platoon in situations that hadn't happened yet. Or hadn't happened, at all. Captain, Brooklyn called from the far side of the chamber, there's a whole section on you. The wall Brooklyn indicated was covered with photos of Graves alone. Pictures taken from impossible angles, above his bunk as he slept, behind him as he wrote reports, beside him as he ate. angles that no human photographer could have achieved without being seen. "How is this possible?" Holt whispered, his rationality finally crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. "What are we dealing with here?" Before Graves could respond, a cry of alarm came from the flooded section of the chamber. Mendoza stood frozen, staring into a pool of standing water. His flashlight beam reflected off the surface, illuminating his terrified expression. "Sergeant?" Graves approached cautiously. "My reflection," Mendoza whispered, not looking away from the water. It's not matching my movements." Graves looked into the pool. At first he saw only what he expected, Mendoza's reflection staring back wide-eyed with fear. Then the reflection blinked. Mendoza didn't. The reflection smiled. Mendoza stumbled backward with a strangled cry just as the water in the pool began to rise, not splashing outward, but cohering into a vertical column. The liquid twisted, forming a rough approximation of a human shape, a water sculpture that mimicked Mendoza's features in grotesque, flowing detail. "Out!" Graves shouted. "Everyone out now!" They retreated in panicked disorder, Brooklyn slipping on the wet stone and nearly falling before Bao hauled him upright. As they ran, the water thing pursued, its movements producing no sound except the occasional liquid gurgle. Back in the main chamber, they found Mendoza's team waiting, unaware of what had transpired. Explanations were cut short as the water creature flowed from the western passage, now having lost Mendoza's shape and becoming something less human, more abstract. "The eastern tunnel," Graves ordered. "Go." The surviving soldiers, American and Vietnamese alike, fled deeper into the tunnel system. Behind them, the sound of flowing water pursued, accompanied now by a high-pitched keening that set teeth on edge. The eastern passage twisted and turned, descending at a steep angle before opening into a vast underground chamber. Unlike the others, this space showed signs of much older construction. Stone pillars carved with intricate symbols, a floor inlaid with weathered mosaics depicting scenes of worship. At the center stood a raised dais, empty now but clearly once the focal point of the chamber. "Temple," Bao gasped, recognizing the architecture. "Ancient, pre-Buddhist." "Where's the exit?" Holt demanded, scanning the walls frantically. "There." Brooklyn pointed to a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber. "Looks like it goes up." As they crossed the chamber, Private Jenkins suddenly stopped, staring in confusion at his hand. "Captain," he called, his voice tight with fear. "Something's wrong." Before their eyes, Jenkins' fingers began to blur, the edges of his body becoming indistinct. He reached out toward Graves, his expression pleading, then simply faded from existence like a photograph bleached by too much sun. One moment there, the next gone, leaving no trace of his presence. "Jenkins!" Holt shouted into the empty space, where the private had stood. "Jenkins!" "Keep moving," Graves ordered, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the horror clawing at his throat. "There's nothing we can do for him." They reached the far passage and began to climb. The slope, steep enough that they had to use handholds cut into the rock. The sound of flowing water had faded, but no one believed they had escaped whatever hunted them. "I don't understand," Holt gasped as they climbed. "How could my own government deploy something like this? It's inhuman." "War often is, Lieutenant," Bao replied grimly. "This goes beyond war," Brooklyn argued. This is playing God." Graves focused on the climb, but his mind raced through the implications of what they'd learned. Project Lighthouse wasn't just a weapon, it was a rupture in reality itself, something that distorted time, space, perception. And if his suspicions were correct, his own commanders had knowingly sent them into its radius as test subjects. Halfway up the passage, Mendoza froze. "Wait, stop." Everyone halted, listening. At first, Graves heard nothing, then he noticed it. The passage ahead of them had changed. When they'd entered, it had been a rough-hewn tunnel through natural rock. Now the walls were smooth, metallic, lined with what looked like modern conduits and lighting fixtures, though they were dark. This isn't possible, Holt whispered. We couldn't have. The passages are shifting, Bao concluded, his calm facade finally showing cracks. The tunnels themselves are changing as we move. Rodriguez, one of the remaining privates, began to hyperventilate. We're trapped. It's playing with us, like a cat with mice. Get a hold of yourself, soldier, Graves ordered, though his own certainty was rapidly eroding. How could they fight an enemy that could reshape reality around them? As if in response to his thoughts, the metal walls began to ripple, undulating like fabric in a breeze. The effect spread, running down the tunnel in waves. Move, Graves shouted. Up, now! They scrambled upward, abandoning any pretense of caution. Behind them, the tunnel continued to distort, sections of floor and ceiling merging, narrowing the passage. One of Bao's men, bringing up the rear, screamed as the contracting walls caught his leg, crushing it instantly. His comrades tried to pull him free, but the metal flowed like liquid, enveloping him. His screams cut off abruptly as his head disappeared into the living metal. The survivors clawed their way up the final stretch, emerging through an opening into blessed fresh air. They collapsed on the ground, gasping, minds reeling from what they'd witnessed. But their relief was short-lived. As Graves regained his feet and looked around, he realized something was terribly wrong. The jungle around them was familiar, yet not. The trees were the same species, but their arrangement was different. The quality of light suggested early morning, not the late afternoon it should have been. Most disturbingly, in the distance stood a mountain peak he didn't recognize, one that definitely hadn't been part of the valley they'd entered. Captain. Brooklyn's voice shook as he checked his watch. My watch says it's 05:30, but that's not possible. Graves checked his own timepiece. 05:30 hours. More than 12 hours had passed in what had felt like 2. Where are we? Holt asked, staring at the unfamiliar landscape. When are we? Mendoza countered, his voice hollow. Bao stood apart from the others, his expression unreadable, as he surveyed their surroundings. Finally, he turned to Graves. Captain, I know this place, this mountain, but it should not be here. What do you mean? This peak lies 300 kilometers north of where we entered the tunnels, Bao said quietly. We are no longer in the same valley. Perhaps no longer in the same time. As the implication sank in, Graves felt the last of his certainty crumble. The tunnels hadn't just been a passage through the earth, they had been a warping of reality itself. And whatever had caused that warping was still out there, still hunting them. Project Lighthouse hadn't just bent the rules of physics. It had broken them entirely. Dawn light filtered through the jungle canopy, casting dappled shadows across the survivors as they gathered their wits. The impossible relocation had left them disoriented, grasping for explanations that rational minds could accept. We must have gotten turned around in the tunnels, Holt insisted, pacing in tight circles. Maybe we were underground longer than we thought, emerged somewhere else. 300 kilometers? Brooklyn countered. Through solid rock? Even if we'd been walking for days. Check your watches, Graves interrupted, a new suspicion forming. All of you. They compared timepieces with growing unease. Graves' watch read 0534 hours, June 17, 1968. Today's date, or what should have been today's date. Holt's showed 1953, the year fixed, but the hands moving at normal speed. Brooklyn's displayed the correct time but wrong month. Most disturbing was Mendoza's. The seconds ticked backward, the minute hand gradually retreating counterclockwise. This isn't possible, Holt whispered, tapping his watch face frantically. None of this is possible, Lieutenant, Mendoza replied, his voice hollow as he watched time literally running backward on his wrist. We've been saying that since this nightmare began. Bao studied the surrounding jungle with the cautious assessment of a man who had spent his life reading the forest's signs. This mountain, he said finally. I know it because I was born in its shadow. My village lay in the valley below. You're sure? Graves asked. A man does not forget the shape of his home, Bao replied simply. But this makes no sense. My village was destroyed in 1954, during the French War, before your Americans came. The implications hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. They had traveled not just through space but through time as well. "Captain," Rodriguez called from the edge of their small clearing, "there's a trail here. Recent. Boot prints." Graves examined the tracks. Standard military issue. American-made. "Could be ours from before we entered the tunnels." "Sir," Rodriguez's voice wavered, "we were never on this mountain." A distant sound drew their attention. Voices, the metallic rattle of equipment, men moving through the jungle. Everyone tensed, weapons rising automatically. "Hold fire," Graves ordered. Could be friendlies. They concealed themselves in the undergrowth as the sounds grew closer. Through gaps in the foliage they watched as a patrol emerged, 8 men in U.S. Army uniforms, moving in standard formation. But something was wrong. The soldiers' uniforms were older models. Their weapons outdated M1 carbines rather than M16s. "Those are Garand rifles," Brooklyn whispered. "Nobody's used those since Korea." As the patrol passed barely 20 feet from their position, Graves caught fragments of conversation. "Telling you this place gives me the creeps," said the Viet Minh control this whole area. "Just need to document the Japanese bunker and get the hell out." The patrol continued on, oblivious to the hidden observers, and disappeared into the jungle. "Viet Minh," Bao repeated once they were gone. "Not Viet Cong. And those uniforms." "Korean War era," Graves confirmed. "Maybe earlier." Brooklyn began to laugh, a high, thin sound edged with hysteria. "So what? We've time traveled? Gone back? To the 50s? "Those men were real," Mendoza countered. "I could smell their cigarettes, hear their footsteps." "Maybe they're like us," Holt suggested, desperation in his voice. "Maybe they're trapped too." "Or maybe they're echoes," Graves said, quietly. Fragments of the past replaying like a recording. They debated their next move, options limited by their incomplete understanding of what they faced. Staying put seemed pointless. The jungle had already proven it could reach them anywhere. Moving toward the mountain peak might provide better visibility, a chance to orient themselves. "We head up," Graves decided. "Follow the ridge. Look for signs of civilization, or at least a defensible position." Their progress was slow, hampered by unfamiliar terrain and constant vigilance. The jungle around them seemed normal one moment, then subtly wrong the next. Flowers blooming and wilting in seconds, insects appearing and vanishing mid-flight. Reality itself felt thin, like tissue paper stretched to tearing. Brooklyn stuck close to Graves, his usual jokes taking on a frantic quality. "Hey, Captain, if we make it back to 69, mind if I look up this girl I knew in Saigon? Figure I could. Warn her about the whole thing, save us both some trouble." "We'll get back, Brooklyn." Sure, but what if we go further? What if we end up in the 70s? I always wanted to know how this whole mess turns out." "Do we win this thing, Captain?" "One step at a time, Corporal." Brooklyn nodded too quickly. Right. One foot in front of the other, that's all we can do, unless time decides to put our feet somewhere else entirely, right?" His laugh held a brittle edge. Graves recognized the signs. Brooklyn was approaching. His breaking point, using humor as his last defense against the incomprehensible. The radio operator had always been their emotional barometer, keeping spirits up when missions went south. Now he was cracking, and the others wouldn't be far behind. Midway up the ridge, they encountered another impossibility. The jungle opened into a small clearing dominated by the rusted hulk of a French tank, its metal hide pierced by dozens of shell impacts, vegetation reclaiming it inch by inch. Chaffee light tank. Bao identified it. From the French War. Mendoza inspected the damage. "This thing's been here for years, decades." 15 years to be precise, Bao said, his voice strangely distant. "This tank was destroyed in April 1953 during a failed offensive against my people." Holt frowned. "How could you possibly know the exact—" "Because I was there," Bao interrupted. I was 16 years old. My first battle. As if summoned. By his words, sounds began to echo through the clearing. Distant explosions, the chatter of old machine guns, men shouting in French and Vietnamese. The air shimmered like a heat mirage, and ghostly figures flickered at the edges of their vision. Soldiers running, falling, fighting a battle long since concluded. "Contact," Rodriguez shouted, raising his rifle at the spectral combatants. "Hold fire," Graves ordered. "They're not real." The phantom battle intensified around them, utterly silent one moment and deafeningly loud the next. Through the chaos, Bao stood transfixed, watching a specific point near the destroyed tank. A young Vietnamese fighter had appeared there, reloading an antique rifle with practiced efficiency, his youthful face set in grim determination. That's me," Bao whispered. The young fighter turned, looking directly at his older self, with an expression of confusion that quickly hardened into resolve. He raised his weapon, aiming at Bao. "Down!" Graves shouted, tackling Bao as the spectral rifle fired. The bullet, impossibly, terrifyingly real, tore through the space where Bao had stood, embedding itself in a tree trunk with a solid thunk. As suddenly as it had appeared, the phantom battle vanished, leaving only the rusted tank and the stunned survivors. "It was real," Holt stammered, his composed facade finally crumbling completely. "They were ghosts, but that bullet was real. How can any of this be happening?" Mendoza examined the bullet hole in the tree, then looked at his watch. The hands now spun freely, cycling through hours and seconds. "Time isn't just broken here," he said quietly. "It's weaponized." Brooklyn's radio, still functioning despite the damage it had sustained, suddenly emitted a burst of static followed by a jumble of transmissions, fragments of communications spanning decades. French forces retreating from Dien Bien Phu. Operation Rolling Thunder commencing. Heavy casualties reported near Da Nang. The voices overlapped, creating a disorienting chorus of war spanning multiple conflicts. Multiple. Ours past, present, and what might be future blended together in a temporal soup. "It's getting worse," Graves observed. "The disruption is spreading." "Or we're going deeper into it," Holt countered, rubbing his temples. "Captain, I'm not sure I can trust what I'm seeing anymore. What if none of this is real? What if we're still in those tunnels, hallucinating all of this? Does it matter?" Mendoza asked bleakly. "Real or not, we still have to find a way out." They continued their ascent, the landscape growing increasingly unstable. Trees appeared fully grown one moment, then reverted to saplings the next. A stream they crossed flowed backward uphill. Birds flew in reverse, returning to their nests rather than leaving them. Brooklyn stumbled, clutching his head. "Captain, there's something wrong with my memories. I can remember things that never happened. A patrol last month where Mitchell died. But Mitchell's still alive, isn't he?" His eyes pleaded for confirmation. "Mitchell's fine," Graves assured him, though uncertainty gnawed at his own mind. Was Mitchell alive? Had that patrol happened? His own memories had begun to feel slippery, unreliable. Half a mile farther, they discovered the first message, crude letters carved deep into a tree trunk. "Do not trust it." "Recent," Mendoza assessed, touching the raw wood. "Days old, maybe less." "Could be other survivors," Holt suggested, a desperate hope entering his voice. "Someone else caught in this thing. Or it could be one of us," Brooklyn said quietly. "From another time." 100 yards later, they found another carved message. "It wears familiar faces." And then another. "The jungle lies." The messages continued, a breadcrumb trail leading them higher up the ridge, each warning more urgent than the last. "Time is not linear here. Your memories are not yours. It speaks through friends. Lighthouse is a door, not a weapon." "Someone's trying to warn us," Holt said, stating the obvious as they paused to rest. "Someone who understands what's happening. Or something is leading us into a trap," Mendoza countered darkly. Graves studied the messages, a creeping suspicion forming. The carving style, the choice of words, they seemed familiar somehow. Like reading his own handwriting. We keep moving, he decided, follow the messages but stay alert. The jungle thinned as they approached the summit, affording glimpses of the surrounding landscape. What they saw defied comprehension. To the east lay pristine, undeveloped forest, untouched by war or human presence. To the west, a patchwork of bomb craters and defoliated zones, the scars of American air campaigns. To the north, French colonial. Buildings stood intact on distant hills. To the south, modern Vietnamese structures. 4 different time periods coexisting in an impossible geographical patchwork. Like a fucking museum exhibit, Brooklyn muttered. A little piece of every war this country's ever suffered through. Holt had stopped responding to the impossibilities around them, his expression vacant, mind retreating from what it couldn't process. This isn't happening, he repeated softly to himself. This cannot be happening. Graves gripped the lieutenant's shoulder. Stay with us, Danny. We need you focused. Focused on what exactly? Holt's voice cracked. On the fact that time itself is broken, that we're seeing ghosts and fighting shadows, that nothing makes sense anymore. He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. I was going to be an engineer, you know. Before the draft, I believed in physics, in rational explanations. What rational explanation is there for any of this? Maybe none, Graves admitted. But we're still soldiers. We still have a mission. What mission? Holt demanded. Survival? Against this? We're already dead, Captain. We just haven't accepted it yet. Before Graves could respond, gunfire erupted. From the jungle below, modern weapons, M16s on full automatic. Not ghostly echoes this time, but present danger. Cover, Graves ordered, the group taking defensive positions among the rocks near the summit. Through his rifle scope, Graves spotted movement in the trees, multiple figures in modern combat. Here, not the vintage uniforms they'd seen earlier. American soldiers methodically sweeping the slope. Sir, Brooklyn hissed. Those are our guys, our actual unit. Graves studied the approaching soldiers more carefully. The lead man's movements were distinctive, the careful precision of a veteran point man. That's Kowalski, he realized, from Baker Company. Could be rescue, Holt suggested, hope flickering across his face. Maybe they tracked us. Or they... Could be like that tank battle, Mendoza warned. Echoes, phantoms. Bao, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for the past hour, suddenly pointed to a position flanking the American patrol. Captain, look. A shadow moved through the trees parallel to the patrol, a solitary figure staying just out of sight of the approaching soldiers. Something about its movement seemed wrong, too fluid, almost predatory. Hold position, Graves ordered. Let them come to us. No one fires unless I give the command. As the patrol drew closer, details became clearer. It was indeed Baker Company. Men Graves recognized had served alongside. But their expressions were wrong, blank, almost mechanical. They moved in formation, but without the natural caution of soldiers in hostile territory. Like automatons or sleepwalkers. The shadow continued pacing them, occasionally visible through gaps in the foliage. Graves caught glimpses of a uniform similar to their own, but the figure's face remained obscured. Sir, Brooklyn whispered urgently, I think I recognize that shadow. The way he moves. That's Jenkins. Jenkins disappeared in the tunnels, Graves reminded him. Exactly. The patrol halted at the base of the slope leading to their position. The point man, Kowalski, raised his fist in the standard signal to stop, then spoke into his radio. Though too distant to hear his words, they could see his lips moving. The shadow, Jenkins if Brooklyn was right, moved closer to the patrol, still unnoticed by the blank-faced soldiers. Now they could see more details. It was definitely an American uniform, though torn and filthy. The figure's movements became more deliberate as it stalked the oblivious men. Captain, Mendoza warned, Whatever that thing is, it's hunting them. Graves had reached the same conclusion. "Warning shot," he ordered. "Above their heads." Mendoza fired a single round into the air. The patrol reacted instantly, dropping into defensive positions with weapons raised. The shadow froze, then melted, back into the jungle. "Baker Company," Graves shouted down the slope. "This is Captain Graves. Hold your fire." For a moment, it seemed the patrol had heard him. Kowalski looked directly toward their position, his expression changing from blank to confused. He turned to his radio man, said something inaudible. Then the jungle between the two groups erupted in chaos. The shadow figure burst from cover, moving with impossible speed, and tore into the patrol. What happened next would haunt Graves, for whatever remained of his life. The thing that might once have been Jenkins moved through the American soldiers like a demon. It didn't use weapons. It used hands that seemed to phase through flesh, extracting something luminous from each man it touched. The soldiers crumpled as it passed, falling like puppets with cut strings. "Open fire," Graves ordered, the survivors sending a barrage of bullets toward the shadow creature. Their shots had no visible effect. The entity finished with the patrol, then turned its face upward toward their position. Even at this distance, they could see that while the uniform was Jenkins, the face was wrong. Older, impossibly older, as though decades had passed in the hours since his disappearance. But the eyes were the most disturbing, wholly black, reflecting nothing. The thing that had been Jenkins smiled. Then it was gone, vanishing into the jungle as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind the broken bodies of Baker Company scattered across the slope. "We need to check for survivors," Holt said automatically, military training asserting itself despite his earlier breakdown. "No," Graves countermanded. "We can't risk it. That thing is still out there." "Those are our men," Holt protested. "Are they?" Graves challenged. "Or are they echoes like the French battle? We don't know what's real anymore, Lieutenant." Brooklyn's radio crackled again, this time with a single clear transmission. "Graves." The voice was Jenkins, but distorted, stretched. "I understand now. Time is a circle here. You will too. When you become like me." The radio fell silent, leaving the survivors staring at each other in horror. The implications were clear. Jenkins hadn't just disappeared in the tunnels. He had been transformed, warped by prolonged exposure to whatever force Project Lighthouse had unleashed. "We need to move," Bao urged, breaking the silence. "That thing, Jenkins, it hunts by movement. It will return." As they gathered their gear to continue toward the summit, Mendoza paused, staring at the tree line where Jenkins had disappeared. "Sir," he said quietly, "what if that's our future? What if that's what happens to all of us if we stay here too long?" Graves had no answer. The thought had already occurred to him. That time itself was a weapon here, aging and twisting those caught in its distortion, that Jenkins's fate awaited them all. "The summit," he said instead. "We get to high ground, get our bearings, one step at a time." As they moved, Brooklyn fell in beside him. "Captain," he whispered, careful not to let the others hear. "My memories are really screwed up now. I can remember dying, sir. 3 different ways, 3 different times. I remember you giving a eulogy at my funeral." Graves looked at the radio operator, seeing genuine terror behind the forced smile. "Hold it together, Brooklyn. Those aren't your memories." "Then whose are they?" Brooklyn asked, his voice cracking. "And why do they feel so real?" The question lingered as they climbed higher, following the trail of carved warnings toward the summit, and whatever waited for them there. They reached the summit as dusk gathered, though whether it was the same day or another was impossible to determine. Time had become a fluid concept, clocks no longer reliable narrators of their experience. The mountain peak offered a panoramic view of the temporal chaos below, a patchwork landscape where different eras collided at unnatural boundaries. "Look," Brooklyn pointed to the southern horizon, where distant flashes illuminated the clouds. Airstrikes. B-52s maybe. Could be from any year, Mendoza replied, his voice flat. Could be happening right now or 20 years ago. Holt had grown increasingly withdrawn, staring at his watch as if it might suddenly begin making sense again. The lieutenant muttered calculations under his breath, equations that couldn't possibly account for the fracturing of reality around them. Graves surveyed their diminished group, 5 Americans including himself, plus Bao and 2 of his men. The rest had been lost to the jungle, to time, to whatever force Project Lighthouse had unleashed. We need shelter, he decided. Something defensible. Near the summit stood the remains of an observation post, concrete bunker, sandbags, rusted communications equipment. Japanese construction probably, though modified by subsequent occupiers. The structure seemed solid enough, offering walls and a roof which felt like rare luxuries after what they'd endured. Rodriguez, Taylor, secure the perimeter, Graves ordered. Brooklyn, see if any of that equipment is salvageable. As the men set about their tasks, Bao approached Graves. The Vietnamese commander had become increasingly introspective since the encounter with his younger self. Your weapon, Bao said quietly. This Project Lighthouse, it was meant to win your war by destroying time itself? I don't know, Graves admitted. I didn't even know it existed until today. And yet here we are, Bao replied, sent directly to it. The implication hung between them, uncomfortable but increasingly difficult to ignore, that their mission had never been about reconnaissance, that they had been sent specifically to activate the device or to test its effects. Brooklyn returned from inspecting the bunker's equipment. Radio gears shot, Captain. Japanese manufacture, probably abandoned in '45. He paused, staring back toward the jungle where darkness had fully settled. Someone's coming. They turned to see a solitary figure limping up the trail toward their position, an American soldier moving with obvious difficulty. Even in the fading light, they could see his uniform was in tatters, his posture bent and labored. Hold fire, Graves ordered as weapons were raised. Identify yourself. The figure stopped, head rising slowly. Captain? Captain Graves? The voice was vaguely familiar, but distorted, aged. As the figure moved closer, stepping into the light spilling from their improvised camp, collective gasps rippled through the group. It was Private Cooper, one of their own, separated during the initial ambush. But not the Cooper they knew. This man's face was deeply lined, his hair gray, body gaunt with age and hardship. Only his eyes remained recognizable, though they held a haunted quality that spoke of years rather than hours of separation. Cooper? Graves approached cautiously. What happened to you? The aged private laughed, a broken sound. Time happened, Captain. Years and years of it all at once. His gaze swept over the survivors. You're all so young, I'd forgotten how young we were. How long? Graves asked, dreading the answer. For me, 23 years. Cooper smiled sadly. I counted as best I could, but the days, they blur. Together after a while. Sometimes the sun rises 3 times in an hour. Sometimes night lasts for weeks. The implications stunned the group into silence. Cooper had experienced more than 2 decades while they'd been separated for mere hours. The temporal distortion is getting worse, Holt murmured, scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. Different rates of time progression in different locations. It's not just watching you, Cooper said suddenly, his gaze intense. It's learning. Every moment you're here, it understands you better. Uses what it finds in your heads to build traps. What does? Graves pressed. What exactly is Project Lighthouse? Cooper's expression darkened. Not a what, a who. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. The device was just a key. It opened something that was locked away. Something old, hungry. This is insane, Rodriguez muttered from the perimeter. Hungry. For what? Mendoza asked, ignoring the interruption. Time, Cooper replied simply. Lives. memories, reality itself. He gestured to his aged body. It fed on my years, on my past. It's feeding on all of us, reshaping us to its will. Brooklyn approached, studying Cooper with a combination of horror and fascination. How did you survive? All this time? Who says I did? Cooper's smile revealed teeth worn to nubs. Maybe I died a dozen times. Maybe we all did. Death isn't permanent here, just another state of being the jungle can manipulate. Graves felt a chill despite the evening heat. Cooper, do you know a way out? A way to escape this? The aged private's expression shifted, something predatory flickering behind his eyes. There's only one escape, Captain. Surrender, let it take what it wants. Without warning, Cooper lunged forward with impossible speed, hands wrapping around Graves's throat with inhuman strength. The captain staggered backward as the others rushed to his aid. It's not just watching, Cooper screamed, his voice distorting, deepening. It's becoming. It took 3 men to pull Cooper off Graves. The aged private fought with unnatural vigor, throwing Rodriguez aside like a child before Mendoza managed to tackle him to the ground. Even then, Cooper continued to struggle, spitting and snarling. He's not Cooper anymore, Bow warned, weapon trained on the thrashing figure. Whatever took Jenkins has him too. Don't kill him, Graves ordered, massaging his bruised throat. Restrain him. They bound Cooper with comm wire, securing him to a concrete pillar inside the bunker. The private alternated between manic laughter and eerie silence, his eyes constantly tracking their movements. You know, don't you, Captain? Cooper said. During one lucid moment, his voice suddenly calm. You know why we're here, why they sent us. We were on a standard recon mission, Graves insisted, though the doubt had been growing in his mind for hours. Lies, Cooper spat. Command knew. They needed test subjects, human minds for it to sample. Holt, who had been silently observing, suddenly stepped forward. He's right, isn't he? This wasn't random. The lieutenant's voice shook with barely controlled rage. Our orders were too specific, the intelligence too precise. We don't know that, Graves countered, but his denial lacked conviction. The coordinates, Holt pressed. The exact route we were to take, the timeline, they lined us up like laboratory rats and marched us straight into this nightmare. Cooper's laughter cut through their argument. The captain knows. He's always known. Why do you think he was chosen to lead? What's he talking about? Brooklyn asked, looking between Cooper and Graves with growing uncertainty. Before Graves could respond, Cooper continued. Ask him about Operation Clockwork. Ask him about the briefing he received before the mission. Graves felt the blood drain from his face. There had been a private briefing, classified, need to know. General Westmoreland himself had outlined certain contingencies, certain observations to be made if unusual conditions were encountered. At the time, Graves had assumed it related to suspected chemical or biological weapons. Captain? Mendoza prompted, all eyes now on Graves. There was a briefing, Graves admitted, but not about this. Nothing specific, just instructions to note any unusual phenomena. Unusual phenomena, Holt repeated incredulously. Like time itself breaking apart, like men being consumed by their own shadows. I didn't know what we were walking into, Graves insisted. But you suspected something, Holt pressed, and you said nothing. Let us right into it. Cooper's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. He sacrificed you. All of you. For the greater good. That's enough, Graves snapped, turning away from the bound figure. Captain, Brooklyn called from outside the bunker, his voice tight with controlled panic. You need to see this. They followed Brooklyn to a small clearing 50 yards from the bunker. What they found there defied comprehension. A field of skeletons, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows as if awaiting inspection. All wore tattered remnants of U.S. military uniforms. All had dog tags. Brooklyn knelt beside the nearest set of remains, lifting the metal identification tags with trembling fingers. These are Peterson's, he said hollowly. Sir Peterson is back at base camp. He rotated home last month. Mendoza moved through the grim display, checking other tags. Williams, Chen, Martinez. He looked up, face ashen. These are all men from our company, men who are still alive. Or who were alive, Rodriguez whispered. When we started the mission. More disturbing still were the dog tags that showed no signs of age, bright metal, freshly stamped. Taylor lifted one, then dropped it as if burned. These are mine, he said, voice cracking. How can these be mine? Graves examined the makeshift graveyard more carefully. The skeletons weren't just from one unit or one time period. Among the American remains lay older bones with Japanese identifiers, French military insignia, Vietnamese militia markers. A museum of death spanning decades, all gathered in this one impossible location. It's collecting us, Mendoza realized aloud. All of us, from different times, different wars. But why so many versions of our unit? Brooklyn asked. Holt's voice was cold when he finally spoke. Because we've been here before. Over and over. Different versions of us from different timelines, all sent to the same slaughter. Graves wanted to refute the lieutenant's theory, but the evidence lay literally at their feet. Somehow Project Lighthouse hadn't just distorted time. It had created overlapping realities, multiple versions of the same mission, the same men, all converging on this point. The weapon feeds on memories, Mendoza theorized as they returned to the bunker. That's why Cooper knew things he shouldn't. That's why Brooklyn is remembering his own death. It's using our pasts, our futures, against us. It's not just watching. Brooklyn quoted Cooper's warning. It's learning. Inside the bunker, they found Cooper had somehow freed one hand from his restraints. On the concrete wall beside him, written in his own blood, was a single message. You were never supposed to leave. The aged private grinned up at them, teeth stained red. I remember now, he said conversationally. How this ends. How it always ends. Cooper, Graves approached cautiously. What happened to the device? The original Project Lighthouse equipment? Buried, Cooper replied. Deep in the valley. But it doesn't matter anymore. The door's already open. And what came through? Graves pressed. Cooper's expression turned distant. Something old, something that existed before time was linear. His focus suddenly sharpened, eyes locking with Graves. It's offering you a deal, Captain. The same deal it always offers. What deal? Save some by sacrificing others, Cooper replied simply. It will let you take 3 men out, just 3, the rest stay as sustenance. The bunker fell silent as the implication settled over the group. Bullshit, Brooklyn finally spat. We all leave together or not at all. Cooper's laughter echoed, off the concrete walls. That's what you always say, every time, every version. The aged private suddenly lunged forward despite his restraints, face contorting with hatred. And that's why you all die. The outburst triggered something in Holt. The lieutenant backed away, eyes wild, hand moving to his sidearm. He's one of them now. Whatever's out there, it's inside him. Lieutenant, Graves said calmly, seeing the danger signs. Stand down. I'm done taking orders from you, Holt replied, voice shaking. You knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. You led us here knowing something was wrong. That's not true, Graves insisted, though the classified briefing hung heavy in his memory. Then why did they choose you specifically for this mission? Holt demanded. Why were our orders so precise? Why were we told to avoid radio contact except in emergencies? The questions hit too close to the doubts that had been gnawing at Graves since they'd discovered the research notes. Had he been selected because of some quality the military thought would make him receptive to the experiment? Had his record of following orders without question made him the perfect pawn? We need to stick together, Graves urged, trying to defuse the tension. Division is what it wants. No, Holt countered, drawing his pistol. What it wants is for us to keep following you, to keep trusting you. And I'm done with that. Mendoza stepped between them. Lieutenant, put the weapon down. We're all on edge, but this isn't helping. Get out of the way, Sergeant. Holt's voice was deadly calm now. The captain's a liability. He's compromised. Probably has been from the start. Brooklyn moved closer to Graves, his loyalty clear despite his fear. Danny, come on, this is crazy. Whatever's happening, it's not the captain's fault. Isn't it? Holt's gaze never left Graves. Cooper said it's learning from us, using our memories. What if it's using what it finds in his head? What if he's the conduit? You're not thinking clearly, Graves said evenly. This thing, whatever it is, it's turning us against each other. That's its strategy. Cooper's voice cut through the standoff, eerily calm and rational now. He's right, about the captain. Every version of this scenario, he's the key, the one who determines whether you live or die. The aged private's eyes gleamed with malicious intelligence. He already chose once, made the deal, left men behind to save himself. What's he talking about? Brooklyn demanded. Graves felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Laos, he said quietly. The operation that went bad 2 years ago. The one where your entire squad died except you, Holt filled in. The one you never talk about. The classified operation had been a disaster, an extraction gone wrong, enemy forces overwhelming their position. Graves had been the only survivor, rescued after 3 days alone in the jungle. The official report cited his exceptional survival skills and tactical decisions. The nightmares that haunted him told a different story. I didn't abandon anyone, Graves stated firmly, though the memories had grown clouded over time, corrupted by guilt and self-doubt. Tell that to Martinez and Jackson, Cooper taunted. Oh, wait, you can't because you left them to die. Enough, Graves snapped. He's compromised, Holt repeated, his pistol unwavering. And he's going to get us all killed, just like he did. Them. Bao, who had been silently observing the escalating conflict, finally spoke. This is what it wants, to divide us when we must stand united. Stay out of this, Holt warned the Vietnamese commander. This is between us. Mendoza made one last attempt to defuse the situation. Lieutenant, if you fire that weapon, you're giving this thing exactly what it wants. Chaos, division, fear. For a moment, it seemed Holt might reconsider. His hand trembled slightly, doubt flickering across his face. Then Cooper began to laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humanity, overlaid with something ancient and malevolent. The aged private's body contorted, spine arching impossibly as his laughter grew in volume and distortion. You're all already dead, Cooper howled. Dead and reborn and dead again. Versions upon versions upon versions. The outburst shattered Holt's last restraint. His eyes hardened with resolve as he raised his pistol, aiming directly at Graves's chest. I'm sorry, Captain, he said with dreadful finality. But I'm not dying for whatever secrets you're keeping. The gunshot echoed off the concrete walls of the bunker, deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the concrete wall inches from Graves's head, sending fragments of stone spraying across his face. Before Holt could fire again, Mendoza launched himself forward, tackling the lieutenant to the ground with bone-jarring force. The pistol skittered across the bunker floor. Have you lost your mind? Mendoza snarled, pinning Holt's arms. Holt struggled wildly, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. Get off me, he's one of them, he's been compromised. Brooklyn retrieved the lieutenant's weapon, backing away with shaken expression. Jesus, Danny, you just tried to kill the captain. Because he's already killed us, Holt screamed. All of us. He knew what we were walking into. Cooper's laughter provided a chilling backdrop to the chaos, the aged private rocking back and forth in his restraints. It started, he sing-songed. Just like before, just like always. Graves touched the shallow cut on his cheek where concrete shrapnel had struck him. The physical pain felt almost irrelevant compared to the psychological wound of having one of his own men, his second in command, try to kill him. Get him secured, Graves ordered, voice tight with controlled emotion. Rodriguez and Taylor helped Mendoza bind Holt with comm wire, The lieutenant had stopped struggling, his body going limp, but his eyes remained fixed on Graves with undisguised hatred. "You don't understand what you're doing," Holt said, his voice suddenly calm. "He's the conduit. It's working through him." "Shut up," Brooklyn snapped, a harshness in his tone that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Outside, the night had taken on an unnatural quality. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness, and distant sounds, not quite animal, not quite human, echoed across the mountain slopes. Reality was continuing to unravel around them. Bao approached Graves, his expression grave. "Captain, we need to speak. Alone." They stepped outside the bunker, moving far enough away that the others couldn't overhear. The Vietnamese commander reached into his tattered uniform and produced a folded document. Weathered, stained, but clearly official. "My intelligence officers recovered this 3 weeks ago," Bao explained. "From the body of an American advisor, near Da Nang. We believed it to be propaganda at first, or misinformation." Graves unfolded the paper carefully. It was a classified military memorandum, bearing the insignia of MACVSOG, the Studies and Observations Group, the most secretive special operations unit in Vietnam. Operation Lighthouse Phase 2, authorization following successful containment, and initial testing, Phase 1. Phase 2 will commence with deployment of specialized reconnaissance teams to sectors Echo 7 through Echo 12. Teams will maintain radio silence except in extremis to prevent signal interference with the temporal anomaly. Primary objective: document effects of exposure on combat personnel in varying temporal dilation zones. Secondary objective: attempt recovery of viable technology from the anomaly periphery. Note: all deployed personnel are considered expendable. Assets for research purposes. No extraction operations authorized within the primary affected zone. 5-kilometer radius from device activation point. Full deniability protocols in effect. In event of unintended escalation, prairie fire contingency authorized. The document was signed by a general whose name Graves recognized, not Westmoreland himself, but a high-ranking member of his staff. The date stamp was 3 days before their mission began. "We were never meant to come back," Graves said quietly, the truth finally crystallizing. "This wasn't a recon mission. We were the experiment." "Yes," Bao agreed grimly, "and my men as well. Both sides, sent to test the weapons' capabilities. Did your commanders know what they were sending you into?" "I suspect some did," Bao replied. "There were rumors, warnings to avoid this valley, but precise orders superseded those warnings." He gestured to the document. "Your Lieutenant Holt was correct about one thing. This was never random." The betrayal cut deeper than Graves could have imagined. His entire military career had been built on trust in the chain of command, on the belief that while missions might be dangerous or even suicidal, they served a greater purpose. To discover that he and his men had been deliberately sacrificed for a science experiment in temporal manipulation shattered that foundation entirely. "The lieutenant was wrong about you, though," Bao continued. "You were not complicit. You were a victim just as we all were." "That doesn't matter now," Graves said, folding the document and placing it in his pocket. "What matters is getting out of here alive." When they returned to the bunker, they found Cooper had somehow freed himself completely from his restraints. The aged private sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Holt with unsettling intensity. "Two betrayers," Cooper observed conversationally, gesturing between Graves and Holt. "The commander who led his men to doom without knowing it. The lieutenant who knew the truth too late to save anyone." His grotesquely aged face split in a, "Both of you thinking you're the hero of this story. Gag him," Graves ordered. As Rodriguez moved to comply, Cooper suddenly lunged, moving with the same unnatural speed he'd displayed earlier. His hand shot out, fingers elongating impossibly to wrap around Rodriguez's throat. Before anyone could react, there was a sickening crack. Rodriguez collapsed, neck broken. Brooklyn fired 3 rounds into Cooper's chest. The aged private staggered backward, blood blossoming across his tattered uniform, but remained standing, His smile never faltered. "This body is already dead," Cooper said, voice deepening to an inhuman register. "Has been for decades." Mendoza emptied his magazine into Cooper's head and torso. The private finally fell, body twitching, black ichor, rather than blood pooling beneath him. Even as they watched, his corpse began to age rapidly, flesh desiccating, collapsing inward until only a skeletal husk remained. "What the actual fuck?" Taylor whispered, backing against the wall. Mendoza reloaded methodically, his hands steady despite the horror they'd witnessed. "We can't stay here," he stated flatly. "Whatever's controlling this place, it can reach us anywhere. We need to find a way to fight back." Graves stared at Cooper's remains, mind racing through their dwindling options. The memorandum mentioned a device activation point, presumably the metallic object they'd discovered in the abandoned camp. But that had been kilometers away, and in a different time frame. Even if they could somehow return to it, what could they do? Then it hit him. "Prairie fire," he said aloud. Brooklyn frowned. "Sir?" "The contingency mentioned in the memo. Prairie fire is the code name for scorched earth protocols. Complete destruction of compromised assets." Graves turned to Bao. "Your men found the memo. Did they find anything else? Any maps, coordinates?" Bao considered for a moment. "Yes, technical schematics, facility layouts." He pulled a crumpled map from his pocket. "This was with the document. We believed it to be a supply depot location." The map showed a valley matching their original operational area, with a structure marked 2 kilometers east of where they'd found the abandoned camp. The notation beside it was unmistakable: emergency termination cache. They built a self-destruct option, Graves realized, in case the experiment went wrong. "Which it clearly has," Brooklyn observed. "If we can reach this facility," Graves continued, studying the map, "we might find explosives, incendiaries, enough firepower to destroy whatever is generating the anomaly. Or trigger an even worse reaction," Mendoza cautioned. "You have a better idea, Sergeant?" Mendoza shook his head grimly. "No, sir. Just noting that we're operating completely blind here." From his restraints against the wall, Holt laughed bitterly. "You're all insane. You think you can blow up time itself? This thing is beyond our comprehension, beyond our weapons." "Maybe," Graves conceded, "but I'm not sitting here waiting to end up like Cooper." They quickly formulated a plan. Using Bao's map and their own reconnaissance experience, they plotted a route that might take them to the cache location, accounting for the temporal and spatial distortions they'd encountered. They had no guarantee the facility still existed in their current time frame, but it was the only concrete objective they had. "What about him?" Brooklyn nodded toward Holt. Graves hesitated. The lieutenant had tried to kill him, but leaving a man behind, even one who had turned against them, went against everything he believed. "We take him," Graves decided. "Restrained, but we take him." "He'll slow us down," Mendoza objected. "Compromise our movement. He's still one of ours," Graves insisted. They gathered what supplies remained and prepared to move out under cover of darkness. Taylor and Brooklyn would take point, with Mendoza guarding the restrained Holt. Graves and Bao, with the latter's 2 remaining men, would form the rear guard. As they exited the bunker, the jungle seemed to sense their intentions. The darkness between the trees grew more pronounced, shadows coalescing into half-formed shapes that flitted at the edges of their vision. The air itself felt resistant, thick with malice. They began their descent down the mountain's eastern slope, using the stars for navigation where possible, though even the constellations seemed wrong, patterns that shouldn't be visible in this hemisphere appearing alongside familiar formations. They had covered less than a kilometer when the whispers started, the same unintelligible voices they'd heard through Brooklyn's radio, but now emanating directly from the forest around them. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, growing in volume until it surrounded them like a physical barrier. "Keep moving," Graves ordered. "Whatever happens, keep moving." The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, not just from the natural slope but from reality's continuing degradation. Patches of ground would suddenly drop away into nothingness. Trees would appear in spaces that had been clear moments before. Twice they were forced to backtrack when the path ahead simply ceased to exist, replaced by impenetrable walls of vegetation that hadn't been there seconds earlier. About halfway down the mountain, they encountered another temporal discontinuity, a section of jungle frozen in the midst of an artillery barrage. Shell explosions hung suspended mid-detonation, fragments of metal and earth caught in mid-air. The figures of soldiers, American, Vietnamese, some from wars decades past, were similarly frozen, their faces trapped in expressions of terror or determination. We go around, Graves decided, unwilling to risk passing through the disturbing tableau. As they circumnavigated the frozen battlefield, Taylor suddenly stopped. "Captain," he called, voice tight with alarm. "Look." Among the suspended figures was Taylor himself, captured in a moment of desperate flight, face contorted in a silent scream as shell fragments tore through his body. "That's not possible," Taylor whispered. "I'm here. I'm right here." "It's not you," Graves tried to reassure him. "It's another version from another timeline." But the damage was done. Taylor stared at his own death with mounting panic, backing away until he stumbled over a root. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't do this. I can't end up like that." "Stay focused, soldier," Graves ordered. "We keep moving. We stick to the plan." They continued their descent, but Taylor remained shaken, jumping at shadows, his confidence shattered by the glimpse of his own fate. The jungle pressed closer, branches reaching like fingers, roots shifting underfoot to trip and hinder their progress. An hour into their journey, they reached the valley floor. According to Bao's map, the cache facility should have been 2 kilometers east. But the landscape before them bore little resemblance to any map, a surreal patchwork of different environments, different times, all bleeding into one another like watercolors on wet paper. "Now what, Captain?" Brooklyn asked, exhaustion evident in his voice. Before Graves could respond, Taylor let out a strangled cry. The soldier stood rigid, staring at his hands as they began to blur at the edges, becoming transparent. "Help me," Taylor pleaded, his voice distorting. "Captain, help!" His form wavered like a heat mirage, then snapped back to solidity, but changed. Taylor now appeared decades older, his hair white, skin deeply lined. He looked at them with momentary confusion before recognition dawned. "Graves?" the aged Taylor said. "How? I've been wandering for years, decades. How are you still young?" "Taylor?" Graves approached cautiously. "What happened to you?" "Got separated, tried to find you. But time kept slipping." The aged soldier looked around with bewilderment. "Is this real? Are you really here?" Before they could respond, Taylor convulsed, his body again blurring at the edges. This time, when he solidified, he was younger than before, a teenage boy in an oversized uniform, eyes wide with terror. "What's happening to me?" the boy Taylor screamed. "The temporal field is intensifying," Bao observed grimly. "He's becoming unstuck, shifting between different versions of himself." Taylor shifted again, older once more, but not as aged as before. This version was battle-hardened, eyes cold with experience. He assessed the group with tactical precision, then focused on Graves. "You need to kill me," this Taylor stated flatly. "All versions of me end up serving it, becoming its eyes, its hands." He glanced down at his own fingers, which had begun elongating unnaturally. "It's already starting. Kill me while I'm still me." "Taylor, we can help you," Graves insisted, though he had no idea how. "No," Taylor's voice deepened, taking on the same resonance they'd heard from Cooper. "You can't." Taylor lunged toward Brooklyn with inhuman speed. Mendoza reacted instantly, firing a 3-round burst that caught Taylor's center mass. The soldier collapsed, body twitching as it cycled rapidly through different ages, young, old, middle-aged, elderly, before finally settling on an emaciated corpse that crumbled to dust before their eyes. The jungle around them seemed to react to Taylor's death, the whispers rising to a howl of rage. Trees bent inward, their bark splitting to reveal something like faces. The ground beneath their feet pulsed like a massive heartbeat. "Move!" Graves shouted. "Double time." They ran, abandoning any pretense of tactical movement, simply trying to put distance between themselves and the animated forest. Brooklyn took the lead, navigating by instinct more than direction, while Mendoza half-dragged the bound Holt, who had fallen into a catatonic state. The foliage parted suddenly, revealing a clearing they hadn't seen from a distance. In its center stood a concrete bunker, partially reclaimed by vegetation but unmistakably man-made. The faded insignia of MacVsog was still visible above the reinforced door. "The cache," Graves breathed. "It's still here." The bunker door was secured with a combination lock. Graves tried the standard SOG emergency access code, nothing. Then the date from the memo, again nothing. "Any ideas?" he asked the others. Bao stepped forward, studying the lock. "Your military enjoys patterns," he observed. "Significant dates, victory dates." Graves nodded, then tried the date of Pearl Harbor. The lock clicked open. The interior of the bunker was untouched by the temporal distortion affecting the jungle, a pocket of normal reality preserved by its reinforced walls. Shelves lined with equipment stood in orderly rows: communications gear, weapons, medical supplies, and explosives. Crates of them. C4, Brooklyn identified, checking one of the crates. "Enough to level a city block." "There's more," Mendoza called from a side room. "Incendiaries, white phosphorus, napalm canisters." Graves found the operations desk, covered with layer of dust but otherwise preserved. A sealed envelope lay atop, a stack of technical documents marked simply Prairie Fire Protocol. Inside was a single page of instructions and a hand-drawn map. The document explained in clinical terms what they already suspected. Project Lighthouse had opened a breach in reality itself, creating a nexus where temporal fields could be manipulated for military advantage. The device they'd found was merely an activation key, triggering something that had been buried in the valley for centuries. The true source of the anomaly lay at the center of the distortion field, a cavern beneath the valley floor, where the original artifact, the document, was frustratingly vague on its nature or origin, had been installed within a containment matrix. The Prairie Fire Protocol called for complete destruction of both the cavern and the activation key, using the supplied explosives set with specific timing sequences. "This is a one-way mission," Graves realized aloud. "Whoever places these charges won't have time to clear the blast radius." Mendoza scanned the document over Graves's shoulder. "Says here the temporal effects will likely intensify as the system is threatened. Anyone inside the perimeter when the charges blow." He left the implication hanging. They would be caught in a final, catastrophic collapse of the temporal field. Their existences potentially erased from reality itself. "How do we even find this cavern?" Brooklyn asked. "That map shows it was 2 clicks west of our original position, but given how the landscape keeps shifting, we use the distortion itself as a guide," Bao suggested. "The effects grow stronger closer to the source. We move toward where reality is most broken." It was a sound if desperate strategy. They gathered the explosives, distributing the weight among the remaining members of the group. Holt, who had remained unresponsive throughout their search of the bunker, suddenly spoke. "It won't work," he said quietly. "You can't destroy it. It exists outside conventional physics." "We're going to try anyway, Lieutenant," Graves replied evenly. "Then you'll need me," Holt continued, his demeanor suddenly disturbingly calm. "I understand its patterns now. I can navigate the distortion field." Graves exchanged glances with Mendoza, both men wary of Holt's abrupt shift in behavior. The lieutenant had gone from trying to kill Graves to offering assistance in the span of hours. "Why the change of heart?" Graves asked. "Because I've seen what awaits us if we fail," Holt answered, his eyes haunted. "In the moments when you thought I was catatonic, I was elsewhere, experiencing other timelines, other outcomes." He shuddered. "We have to end this, no matter the cost." Against his better judgment, Graves ordered Holt released from his restraints. The lieutenant rubbed his chafed wrists, then immediately began studying the map of the cavern system. "The entrance will be disguised," Holt said with disturbing certainty. "Obscured by temporal camouflage. We'll need to synchronize our perceptions to find it." "And how exactly do we do that?" Brooklyn asked skeptically. Holt glanced, up a strange glint in his eye. "We embrace the distortion. Let it in, just enough to see beyond conventional reality." "That's suicide," Mendoza objected. "We've seen what happens when it gets in your head. Cooper, Taylor, they lost themselves completely." "Not completely," Holt corrected. "Not at first. There's a window, a period where heightened perception precedes total corruption. We need to operate within that window." It was reckless, desperate, and possibly insane. It was also, Graves realized, their only chance. They emerged from the bunker to find the jungle had changed yet again. The trees had rearranged themselves, forming a rough spiral pattern centered on something in the distance, a distortion in the air itself like heat waves, but more pronounced, more deliberate. "There," Holt pointed. "That's our entry point." They advanced cautiously, the whispers returning with renewed intensity. The ground beneath their feet no longer felt solid. It rippled slightly with each step, like walking on a waterbed. Colors became more vivid, then faded to monochrome, then blazed again with unnatural brightness. "It knows," Bao said quietly. "It knows what we intend." The Vietnamese commander's two remaining men suddenly screamed, clutching their heads. Before anyone could react, both men simply unwound, their bodies unraveling like spools of thread, the strands disappearing into thin air until nothing remained. "Keep moving," Graves ordered, fighting the horror that threatened to overwhelm them. "All, eyes forward. Whatever happens, we reach that distortion point." The jungle's resistance grew more aggressive as they approached their target. Vines animated with serpentine purpose, reaching for ankles and wrists. The air thickened until each breath required conscious effort. Gravity itself seemed to fluctuate, alternately pressing them down with crushing force or leaving them nearly weightless. "Almost there," Holt called, his voice taking on a strange, echoing quality. The lieutenant moved with increasing confidence, as if the distortions affected him less than the others, or as if he was beginning to merge with them. They reached the center of the spiral. Up close, the distortion resembled a vertical tear. In reality, a jagged line of nothingness that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Beyond it, barely visible, stone steps descended into darkness. "The cavern entrance," Holt confirmed, just as the map showed. As they prepared to cross the threshold, a massive tremor shook the jungle. Trees toppled, the ground split open in jagged cracks, and the whispers rose to a deafening chorus of rage. The tier in reality began to contract, threatening to close before they could enter. "It's trying to seal the entrance," Brooklyn shouted. Over the cacophony, Bao stepped forward, expression resolute. "I will hold it open, the rest of you go." "Commander," Graves began. "This is not negotiable, Captain," Bao cut him off. "My men are gone. My war is meaningless compared to this threat." He shouldered his rifle. "I will buy you time." Before Graves could argue further, Bao moved to the edges of the tear, physically bracing himself against the contracting rift. The Vietnamese commander's body immediately began to distort, stretching and compressing as reality itself fought against his interference. "Go!" Bao shouted, his voice already changing, deepening with the same resonance they'd heard from Cooper and Taylor. "I cannot hold it long." Graves hesitated only briefly before making the hardest command decision of his life. "Through the tier. Now." Mendoza went first, then Brooklyn with the explosives. Holt followed, his movements oddly fluid, as if he'd begun to adapt to the distortion field's physics. Graves was last, pausing at the threshold to look back at Bao. The Vietnamese commander's body had lost most of its human characteristics, stretching and twisting as it held the tier open. But his eyes, those remained his own. meeting Graves's gaze with fierce determination. Your enemy became your ally, Bao managed through a mouth that was no longer entirely human. Remember that, if you survive. Graves nodded once, a gesture of profound respect, then stepped through the tear. Behind him, Bao's final cry of defiance was cut short as the rift sealed, leaving only stone walls and the descending staircase. The cavern below felt ancient beyond reckoning. Glyphs covered the walls similar to those they'd seen in the temple beneath the mountain, but older, more primal. Their flashlights revealed a vast central chamber where natural rock formations merged with structures of obvious but alien design. At the chamber's center stood a raised platform of black stone. Embedded within it was a crystalline object about the size of a man's head, pulsing with internal light that shifted through colors they had no names for. Around the platform, arranged in a perfect circle, stood metallic pylons of modern manufacture. The containment matrix described in the Prairie Fire Protocol, and the matrix was failing. Arcs of energy jumped between the pylons, each discharge accompanied by a visible ripple in the air, reality itself protesting the violation of its fundamental laws. The artifact, Holt whispered, approaching the platform with unsettling eagerness. The key to everything. Stay focused, Lieutenant, Graves warned. We're here to destroy it, not study it. They set to work placing the explosives according to the protocol's specifications, shaped charges around the platform, incendiaries near the matrix pylons, with timed detonators synchronized to trigger a cascading reaction. The work was meticulous and demanding, requiring exact positioning despite the disorienting environment of the cavern, where gravity and perspective seemed to shift unpredictably. As they worked, Brooklyn suddenly froze, staring at the crystalline artifact. "Captain," he said quietly, "I can hear it. In my head." "Ignore it," Graves ordered. "Focus on the charges." "It's offering things," Brooklyn continued, his voice taking on the faraway quality that had preceded Taylor's transformation. "Answers, knowledge, a way home." Mendoza gripped Brooklyn's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Stay with us, man. Remember what happened to the others." Brooklyn blinked rapidly, then nodded. "Right. Yeah, sorry." But his eyes kept drifting back to the artifact. Holt, meanwhile, had finished placing his charges and now stood directly before the crystal, studying it with uncomfortable intensity. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "Do you understand what this is, Captain? Not just a weapon, a gateway, a means to rewrite reality itself." "Lieutenant," Graves said sharply, "step away from the artifact." Holt turned, and Graves saw with sinking certainty that the man's eyes had changed. The pupils elongated, irises shifted to an impossible color. "They never intended to use it as just a weapon," Holt said, his voice overlaid with something older, deeper. "They wanted to change the past, erase defeats, prevent deaths, play God." "Holt," Graves tried once more. "Danny, fight it." "I am," Holt replied, a brief flicker of his true self showing through. "But it's so strong, Captain. So persuasive." He gestured to the artifact. "And it's right. With this we could end the war. Save everyone who ever died in this God-forsaken country." "At what cost?" Graves demanded. "Look what it's done already. Cooper, Taylor, Bao. This thing doesn't create, it corrupts." For a moment it seemed Holt might listen. The lieutenant's expression wavered, humanity briefly reasserting itself. Then the artifact pulsed, its light intensifying, and Holt's face hardened with resolve. "I can't let you destroy it," he declared, drawing his sidearm. "Step away from the charges." It had come full circle, Holt once again aiming a weapon at Graves, but this time with the artifact's influence clearly directing his actions. "Last chance, Lieutenant," Graves warned, his own weapon raised. "Stand down." Brooklyn and Mendoza had also drawn their weapons, creating a 3-to-1 standoff, but Holt merely smiled, an expression devoid of humanity. "You don't understand," he said, voice deepening further. "I'm not alone." From the shadows around the cavern's perimeter, figures emerged. Soldiers in tattered uniforms spanning decades of warfare. Americans, Vietnamese, Japanese, French, all with the same blank expressions, the same elongated pupils, all under the artifact's control. Jesus, Brooklyn whispered. There must be dozens of them. All versions of us, Holt confirmed, from timelines where we failed, where we chose to serve rather than destroy. The phantom soldiers advanced slowly, their movements unnaturally synchronized. Some held weapons, others had hands that had transformed into claw-like appendages. Captain, Mendoza said urgently, the charges are set. We need to trigger them and get out of here. Graves assessed their position grimly. The protocol had been clear. The optimal position for detonation was from within the cavern itself, ensuring precise timing. But with Holt compromised and the phantom soldiers blocking their escape, they needed to adapt. Mendoza, Graves said quietly, take Brooklyn and go. Get clear of the blast radius if you can. Sir, that's an order, Sergeant. Graves kept his weapon trained on Holt. I'll handle the detonation. Mendoza hesitated only briefly before accepting the command. It's been an honor, Captain. Likewise, Sergeant. Graves didn't take his eyes off Holt. Now go. Brooklyn gripped Graves's shoulder once, a wordless goodbye. Then he and Mendoza began backing toward the stairs. The phantom soldiers moved to intercept them, but Graves fired 2 precise shots, dropping the nearest figures. Go, he shouted. As Mendoza and Brooklyn made their break for the exit, Graves maintained covering fire, buying them precious seconds. Holt watched with detached interest, making no move to stop them. They won't escape, Holt said with certainty. The jungle will find them. Bring them back, like it did all the others. Maybe, Graves conceded, mentally calculating how long it would take them to reach minimum safe distance, if such a thing even existed within the distortion field. But I'm making sure you won't be there to see it. Understanding dawned in Holt's altered eyes. You're staying to trigger the charges manually. Someone has to. It won't work, Holt insisted. The artifact can't be destroyed by conventional explosives. It exists partially outside normal spacetime. We'll see, Graves replied, his finger moving to the detonator switch. Holt raised his weapon, aiming directly at Graves's head. I can't let you do this, Captain. You already tried to kill me once today, Lieutenant, Graves reminded him. Didn't take. For a fleeting moment, something like regret flickered across Holt's face. Last glimpse of the man he had been. I'm sorry, he said, and pulled the trigger. Graves was already moving, diving behind one of the matrix pylons as Holt's shot went wide. The phantom soldiers surged forward, converging on his position from all sides. Graves fired methodically, each shot finding its mark, but for every phantom that fell, 2 more emerged from the shadows. They were closing in, and the detonator still lay exposed on the platform beside the final charge. Time seemed to slow as Graves made his decision. He broke from cover, charging directly toward the platform. Holt fired again, the bullet grazing Graves's arm but failing to stop his momentum. The phantom soldiers reached with elongated limbs, their fingers brushing his uniform as he lunged for the detonator. His hand closed around the switch, just as Holt fired a 3rd time. This shot found its mark, punching through Graves' side with white-hot agony. He fell against the platform, vision blurring, but his grip on the detonator remained firm. Holt approached slowly, weapon still raised. The artifact can save you, he offered. Heal you, make you more than human. I've seen what it makes people, Graves managed through gritted teeth. I'll pass. The lieutenant shook his head with something like disappointment. Then you die here, alone, having accomplished nothing. Graves smiled through the pain. Not alone, he corrected, tightening his grip on the detonator. And not nothing. With the last of his strength, Captain Michael Graves pressed the switch. The world went white. The detonation sequence began with a single charge, then cascaded through the cavern in a choreographed symphony of destruction. The containment matrix shattered first, its pylons collapsing inward as the shaped charges performed their precise work. Then came the secondary explosions targeting the support structures of the cavern itself. Through the pain of his gunshot wound, Graves witnessed the artifact's reaction, the crystalline structure pulsing with frantic energy, fractures spreading across its surface like lightning. Holt screamed, not in fear but in rage, his body contorting, as the connection between him and the artifact violently severed. The phantom soldiers dissipated like smoke, their forms unraveling as their anchor to reality weakened. The cavern walls began to collapse, massive stone slabs crashing down around the platform. Graves had expected to die in that moment, had made peace with it. Instead, he found himself suddenly, inexplicably outside the cavern, lying on the jungle floor as the ground trembled beneath him. The explosion had somehow displaced him, thrown him through space in the artifact's death throes. The jungle was in chaos. The very fabric of reality seemed to be tearing apart as the artifact's influence collapsed. Trees ignited spontaneously, burning with flames in impossible colors. The ground rippled like water, forming waves that rolled outward from the blast epicenter. The air itself seemed to scream, the whispers that had haunted them now rising to a cacophonous wail. 50 yards away, Graves spotted Mendoza and Brooklyn, running for their lives through the disintegrating landscape. He tried to call out, but his voice was lost in the maelstrom. Pushing through the pain of his wound, he staggered to his feet and began pursuing them. "Mendoza!" he finally managed to shout. "Brooklyn, wait!" Brooklyn turned, eyes widening at the sight of his captain somehow alive. "Sir!" he called back, changing direction to move toward Graves. But the jungle had other plans. The ground between them suddenly split open, a jagged chasm appearing from nowhere. Brooklyn skidded to a halt at its edge, nearly tumbling into the abyss. On the far side, Mendoza was already running back to help. "Jump!" Mendoza shouted to Brooklyn. "I'll catch you." Brooklyn backed up a few paces, preparing to make the leap, then froze in horror. From the chasm rose tendrils of living darkness, writhing like tentacles as they reached for him. "Go!" Brooklyn yelled to Mendoza. "Keep moving. I'll find another way around." Mendoza hesitated, torn between helping Brooklyn and following orders. The sergeant's expression hardened with resolve, and he turned to sprint back toward Graves. The jungle's fury intensified. Trees uprooted themselves, crashing down in their path. Vines animated with malevolent purpose, whipping through the air with lethal force. The very ground beneath their feet became treacherous, sections dropping, away into nothingness without warning. Mendoza reached Graves, supporting the wounded captain as they stumbled forward. "Brooklyn?" Graves gasped through the pain. "Trying to find another way across," Mendoza replied grimly. "We need to keep moving, sir. This whole place is coming apart." They pushed onward through the chaos, following a ridgeline that seemed marginally more stable than the collapsing jungle below. Behind them, the valley had become an inferno, flames leaping from tree to tree in defiance of natural fire patterns. Above, the sky had fractured like broken glass, showing glimpses of different times of day through the cracks. Dawn, noon, midnight, all visible simultaneously. "There!" Mendoza pointed ahead to where the jungle thinned, revealing what looked like a road or clearing in the distance. "That might be our way out." They redoubled their efforts, hope providing fresh reserves of strength. But as they approached what appeared to be the edge of the distortion field, a sound reached them. Brooklyn's voice, crackling through the radio still strapped to Mendoza's back. "Captain! Mendoza!" The transmission was broken, distorted. "The chasm, it's spreading, can't find a way." Static consumed his words momentarily, then, "Something's coming through. It's..." Brooklyn's transmission cut off in a burst of white noise. "We have to go back for him," Graves insisted, trying to turn. "No time, sir," Mendoza replied, maintaining their forward momentum. "The whole zone is collapsing. If we don't make it out now, none of us will." The logic was sound, but it felt like another betrayal, another man left behind. Graves glanced back, hoping for some sign of Brooklyn following them, but saw only the advancing wall of chaos as reality continued to unravel. They were within 100 yards of the apparent boundary when Mendoza suddenly stumbled, crying out in pain and surprise. Looking down, Graves saw why. Roots had erupted from the ground, wrapping around the sergeant's legs like constricting snakes. "Keep going, sir," Mendoza shouted, pushing Graves away while drawing his combat knife to hack at the entangling roots. "I'll catch up." "Not a chance, Sergeant," Graves replied, drawing his own knife and dropping to one knee despite the burning pain in his side. Together they slashed at the roots, severing several before more burst from the ground to replace them. The entanglement spread rapidly, climbing up Mendoza's legs toward his torso. "It's too fast," Mendoza grunted, still fighting. "Captain, you need to go. Someone has to make it back. Tell them what happened here." "I'm not leaving you," Graves insisted. Mendoza looked him directly in the eyes. "Sir, with respect, you don't have a choice." With a sudden, powerful shove, Mendoza pushed Graves clear of the advancing roots. The captain fell backward, his wound screaming in protest at the impact. When he looked up, Mendoza was already half submerged in the ground, still fighting furiously but losing the battle. "That's an order, Captain," Mendoza called, his voice steady despite his dire situation. "Get the hell out of here. Tell them what their experiment did." The roots pulled Mendoza deeper, now reaching his chest. His face remained composed, the consummate soldier to the end. "Been an honor, sir," he managed just before the earth claimed him completely, leaving nothing behind but his combat knife lying on the suddenly still ground. Graves stared at the spot where Mendoza had vanished, shock and grief momentarily overwhelming him. Then the advancing wall of chaos jolted him back to survival instinct. He grabbed Mendoza's knife, tucking it into his belt, and forced himself to his feet. The boundary was close now, barely 50 yards away. Beyond it, the jungle appeared normal, unaffected by the temporal distortion. Graves ran, ignoring the fire in his side, the blood soaking his uniform, the grief threatening to overwhelm him. 30 yards, 20-10. Just as he approached the apparent edge of the distortion field, a final obstacle emerged. The air before him rippled and a figure stepped through. Lieutenant Holt, or what remained of him. The lieutenant's body had been transformed, elongated and twisted, his skin translucent enough to show pulsing light beneath. His eyes were entirely black, reflecting nothing. "Captain," Holt's voice was layered with others, a chorus of different versions speaking in unison. "You can't leave. None of us can leave." "The artifact is destroyed," Graves countered, knife in one hand, pistol in the other, despite knowing bullets had little effect on whatever Holt had become. "The vessel is damaged," Holt corrected, his unnatural form rippling like heat waves. "But what it contained, what it released, that cannot be destroyed. Only contained. Only fed." "Get out of my way, Lieutenant," Graves warned, though the title no longer seemed appropriate for the thing before him. Holt smiled, his mouth stretching impossibly wide. "I'm offering you a choice, Captain. The same choice it always offers. Stay willingly, become part of it, or be taken like the others." Graves raised his weapon. "I choose neither." He fired 3 rapid shots into what had been Holt's face. The entity staggered backward, more in surprise than pain, black ichor leaking from the wounds before they sealed themselves. Graves used the momentary distraction to lunge forward, driving Mendoza's knife deep into Holt's chest. The entity shrieked, not in Holt's voice, but in something ancient and inhuman. Its form began to destabilize, edges blurring, limbs dissolving into smoke. Graves pushed past it, running for the boundary with the last of his strength. He felt the moment he crossed the threshold, a sensation like passing through an electrical field, every hair on his body standing on end. Behind him, the distorted jungle's rage reached a crescendo. Trees toppling, ground heaving, the very air seeming to tear itself apart. Graves ran until his legs gave out and he collapsed, consciousness fading as blood loss and exhaustion finally claimed him. His last thought before darkness took him was of the men he'd left behind, not just his platoon but all those who had been sacrificed to Project Lighthouse over the years. All the versions of themselves trapped in that nightmare. He awoke to the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors. Dawn light filtered through the cabin as Graves slowly regained consciousness, finding himself strapped to a stretcher inside a medevac chopper. A medic leaned over him, checking his vitals, expression professionally neutral. "Captain's awake." The medic called to someone Graves couldn't see. A face appeared in his field of vision. A colonel he didn't recognize, wearing the insignia of military intelligence. "Captain Graves," the officer said without preamble. "You're the only survivor we found. Can you tell me what happened to your men?" Graves tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The medic offered water, which he gratefully accepted before trying again. "Ambushed," he managed, the partial truth easier than the full one. "VC had advance intelligence on our position. We were overrun." The colonel's expression revealed nothing. "And the enemy forces?" "We found a significant number of casualties, but reports indicate they weren't killed by conventional weapons." Memories flashed through Graves's mind. Soldiers consumed by their own shadows, the ground swallowing men whole, reality itself turning against them. The truth would sound like the ravings of a madman. "Napalm," he lied. "We called in an emergency strike on our own position when we were overrun. Caught them in the open." "There's no record of such a strike being authorized," the colonel noted, studying Graves carefully. "Radio operator made the call. Didn't have time for formalities." Graves held the officer's gaze, daring him to challenge the story. After a long moment, the colonel nodded, apparently accepting the explanation, or at least recognizing he wouldn't get another. "Your actions saved valuable intelligence, Captain. The information your team gathered on enemy movements in that valley will prove crucial." The casual eye confirmed what Graves had already suspected. They knew, perhaps not the full extent of what Project Lighthouse had become, but enough to cover it up, to create a sanitized version of events that wouldn't raise difficult questions. "Rest now," the colonel continued, patting Graves's shoulder with false camaraderie. "We'll debrief properly when you're recovered." As the officer moved away, Graves turned his head to look out the helicopter's open door. The jungle stretched below them, a sea of green that looked so normal, so innocent from this height. They were flying along the edge of the valley where it had all happened, where Project Lighthouse had torn reality apart, where Brooklyn, Mendoza, and all the others had been lost. From this altitude, there was no sign of the chaos they'd experienced, no temporal distortions, no reality fractures, just pristine jungle, untouched by the nightmare beneath its canopy. Had the destruction of the artifact repaired the damage? Or had the jungle simply covered its tracks, hiding its true nature once again? As he watched, something caught his eye, a pattern in the trees below. What had appeared random from a distance revealed itself with horrifying clarity to be deliberate. The jungle canopy had formed a perfect spiral pattern, centered on what must have been the cavern's location. And at its center, a clearing had formed in the shape of an eye that seemed to be looking directly at the helicopter. Directly at Graves. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence, a trick of perspective, or his trauma-addled mind seeing patterns where none existed. But as they flew onward, the eye seemed to track their movement, the spiral pattern rotating slightly to maintain its focus on the departing aircraft. "Sir?" The medic had returned, concerned by Graves's increased heart rate. "Are you in pain?" Graves couldn't tear his gaze from the watching jungle. "No," he managed. "I'm fine." The medic followed his line of sight, staring down at the same pattern. "Weird how the trees grow like that sometimes," he commented casually. "Almost looks like it's watching us, doesn't it?" So others could see it too. It wasn't just in his mind. The helicopter banked, changing course, and the valley fell behind them. Graves closed his eyes, trying to find some measure of peace in the knowledge that he had survived, that he had destroyed the artifact, that the nightmare was contained if not ended. That's when he heard it. Faint at first, barely audible over the rotor noise, but growing clearer. A familiar static crackle, a sound that should have been impossible. Brooklyn's radio, the one that had been with Mendoza when the jungle claimed him, was somehow in the helicopter tucked beside Graves's stretcher. Its control lights blinked rhythmically despite the unit being battered nearly beyond recognition. Graves stared at it in disbelief. No one else in the helicopter seemed to notice its presence, the medic walking past it without a glance as he checked on another wounded soldier. The static cleared momentarily, replaced by a voice that sent ice through Graves's veins. Not one voice, but many, speaking in perfect unison. Brooklyn's voice layered with Mendoza's, with Holt's, with Cooper's, with countless others he didn't recognize. "You were not supposed to survive," they whispered, the sound seeming to come from inside his own head rather than the radio itself. Graves reached for the unit with trembling hands, intending to silence it, to throw it from the helicopter if necessary. But as his fingers touched its surface, the radio crumbled to dust, disappearing as if it had never existed. He looked out at the receding jungle once more. The spiral pattern was no longer visible from this distance, but he could still feel it. The weight of its attention, its patient malevolence. The certainty that what they had encountered was not destroyed, merely wounded, and that it would heal. It would wait. It would remember. Captain Michael Graves leaned back on his stretcher, the weight of survival pressing down on him more heavily than any physical pain. He had escaped the jungle's grasp, but he knew with bone-deep certainty that a part of him remained there, trapped with Brooklyn, with Mendoza, with all the others who had been consumed. And perhaps a part of the jungle had left with him as, well, embedded somewhere deep in his mind, watching, waiting for the day it could reclaim what had escaped. The helicopter flew onward, carrying the last survivor away from the jungle's secret. But even as the landscape below transformed from wilderness to the ordered patterns of civilization, Graves knew the truth that would haunt him for the rest of his days. No one ever truly escapes the jungle. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.